A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I always believed my wife was the kind of person who turned to her vices only in times of need. I imagine this is what everyone tells themselves to feel better about the gradual unraveling of love, but I guess that's what emphatically made me miss the signs. For months now, I'd watched her growing listlessness, the way she'd appear too withdrawn from me. Her laughter that once echoed through our home began to dwindle down to strained smiles that barely broke the surface of her lips, and the way she turned away from my touch as if my fingers were ice cold against her skin. It was only when I noticed the syringes, a clinical little cluster tucked away beneath the bathroom sink, each needle capped and clean, that an uncomfortable truth began steering itself into my consciousness like an unwanted guest at a party. I sifted through our daily routine, remembering small moments like how her makeup started to dissolve into that pallor of disinterest and how I sometimes caught her locked in a blank stare, deep in thought, at a clock that only ticked toward deadlines I couldn't see. At first, I made excuses for the absences that took her away from me each night, late shifts at the hospital, long nights with her friends indulging in laughter and alcohol, but an undercurrent of suspicion, a nagging at the back of my mind, led me into that dimly lit bathroom one evening, armed with curiosity and an ache I didn't want to feel. I twisted the handle and opened the door to the musty air, coming face to face with the stark array of syringes. I examined them with increasing horror, knowing that no prescribed medication in the world came in such quantities, each syringe brandishing a promise of something far darker. My heart raced as I scrambled through my mental archives of her erratic behavior, the sudden weight loss, the insomnia that wrapped itself around her like a suffocating blanket, and the glazed-over conversations that dimmed her once radiant personality. Could it be drugs? Was I living with someone who had fallen prey to the very demons that transformed lives into chaos? But then a thought flickered in my mind, an alternative narrative that made my insides twist uncomfortably. What if these syringes were merely the symptom of a deeper condition that I hadn't recognized yet? Panic set in, as I began to suspect I was losing her emotionally, so I resolved to confront her, needing some semblance of clarity, only for her to come home late, her eyes gleaming with a fright I didn't understand. I found something, I managed to choke out, standing between her and the living room as a self-appointed gatekeeper. The smartphone she held fell carelessly to the couch, and her gaze darted like a deer caught in headlights before flattening into something weary. "They're just for my anxiety," she said, her body language crumbling as she leant against the door frame, feigning calmness despite the tiny tremors racing through her fingers. In that moment, her denial pierced me through like shards of ice. I could see right through the fabric of her excuse, the way each breath she took felt laborious yet laced with secrets. Days morphed into a cyclical nightmare as I buried myself in research late into the night. I dug through forums and dark web threads, each confirmed suspicion anchoring my concerns into reality. I crossed paths with the names of drugs I'd never heard before, stimulants, mood enhancers, and a realm of substances that thrived in shadows and darkness. My fingers touched every labeled document and news report that hinted at the dangers of addiction, only to find the name of a particular substance that existed beyond legality and ethics, a synthetic concoction rumored to transform users into mere puppets of some clandestine purpose, frayed threads of sanity stitched together in a frantic desperation. It was all too much a revelation to bear, a secret that gnawed at the edges of my psyche. I clung desperately to clarity as weeks flickered by, her late-night absences, the unexplained bruises tracing lines across her forearms like a morbid map, each one an imprint of betrayal and pain. The night I finally confronted her again, the atmosphere buzzed with electric tension. I quaked while she stood opposite me, a mere silhouette against the moonlight casting shadows through our living room window. "You think I'm doing drugs?" she said, a low laugh escaping her lips that split the silence between us like glass shattering onto concrete. "You couldn't be more wrong, John." Her laughter morphed into something darker, a smile that held on to empty shards of her fractured reality. In a breath that felt like poison lingering in the air, she took a step closer, holding her arms out as if a warm embrace could shatter the storm between us. I recoiled instinctively, wanting nothing to do with the unsettling aura surrounding her. "I'm not medicating myself, I'm helping others," she declared, as if her voice had the power to convince us both. My mouth went dry, realizing in that moment how swiftly she slipped away. My sweet, loving wife had transformed into a messenger of something sinister, and I couldn't fight the instinctual dread crawling within me. "What do you mean?" I never meant for the words to betray me, but they slipped out like confetti bursting from a piñata. You won't understand, she finally whispered, her voice shaking beneath the weight of a hidden truth, then left for the kitchen. I followed behind her, desperate to seize the moment, to grasp any ounce of comfort I could salvage, but what awaited me chilled my blood. There, on the kitchen counter, lay a single syringe filled with a liquid shimmering like starlight, coupled with a series of handwritten notes that revealed the unthinkable. She was using these substances not to numb herself, but somehow to bring back people who'd lost their lives. The words explained it all, whispered promises of chemical society, of using the unbound energy of vitality to escape the confines of death. She had turned into something beyond a mere user. She was a puppeteer pulling strings to orchestrate something far more grotesque than addiction. The realization staggered me, sent jagged patterns racing across my vision, and I stood frozen in horror as she turned, realization dawning in her eyes, something primal igniting within her that felt otherworldly, as she recited the ominous truth: there's a thin line between life and death, and she intended to walk it barefoot. My heart thundered in my chest, but I didn't have the will to run. I wanted to hate her, to scream, to shatter the moment into pieces, but more than anything, I felt like a bystander in my own life, witnessing an act too terrifying to comprehend. In that suffocating moment, the waves of regret and despair pulled me under, and as the moon masked itself behind dark clouds looming outside, I realized I was not only losing my wife but stepping unwittingly into a world where the natural laws of life and death ebbed and flowed at her fingertips, tethered to the ominous allure of those syringes. My Tinder date made me take a shower in front of her, and as I sit here replaying the events in my mind, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something far worse than embarrassment. It all started innocently enough. We had been chatting for a week, swapping flirty texts and goofy memes, and we both couldn't wait to meet in person. Sarah boasted this wild sense of adventure, and when we finally settled on a cozy little pub, my heart raced with the excitement of it all. She was even hotter than her pictures, with dark hair framing a mischievous face that made my stomach flutter. We laughed over drinks, and the night moved effortlessly, as conversations flowed like the whiskey in our glasses. But when Sarah suggested heading back to her place to continue the fun, a rush of exhilaration clouded my better judgment. Once we arrived at her apartment, she excitedly pushed me through the door, laughing and teasing as she poured us more drinks and turned on some music, the bass thumping through the walls. We danced, we flirted, and I could feel the chemistry building, a fire igniting deep within me. Just when I thought things couldn't get any better, Sarah paused mid-movement, looking me straight in the eye with a wild grin that sent shivers down my spine. "You know what would be fun?" she said, her tone playful yet filled with an eerie edge. "You should take a shower. Right now. In front of me." I froze, unsure if she was joking or if the alcohol had finally muddled my perception of reality. "Wait, what?" I laughed nervously, but Sarah's gaze remained locked onto mine, a mixture of lingering desire and something darker twinkling behind her eyes. "Come on, it'll be a blast. I like to keep things interesting." My initial instinct was to refuse, my cheeks flush with the mingling embarrassment and confusion swirling in my gut, yet a part of me was undeniably intrigued by her boldness. I figured it was just a quirky moment, maybe even some form of foreplay I wasn't savvy enough to know about. So, against my better judgment, I found myself standing in her bathroom, the cold tiles sending a shiver up my spine as I removed my clothes while Sarah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me intently. There was a charged silence as the water warmed up, and I let the stream envelop me, hoping that would ease the mounting awkwardness. I caught glimpses of Sarah through the steamed glass, her silhouette utterly captivating yet surreal. Just as I was starting to settle into the absurdity of the situation, I heard her voice cutting through the sound of the running water. "Does it feel nice?" I nodded, brushing my wet hair back, half disoriented by the bizarre intimacy she urged. Her laughter echoed like a distant memory wrapped in something sinister. "Good," she said, but then her tone shifted, a razor-like edge slicing through to catch my attention. "You know, I love seeing people in vulnerable situations. Sometimes I just want to know what's behind the mask." Confused, my heart began racing again. Was this playful banter, or was I trapped in some odd game I didn't understand? The air felt heavier, and that sliver of worry began to gnaw at the back of my mind. I turned off the water and stepped out, letting the steam billow out to fill the room, suddenly feeling the weight of her gaze. "What do you think I'd see if I could look past your mask?" she asked slowly, her question unfurling like a dark ribbon in the air between us. I don't know," I stuttered, my heart thumping wildly as an unsettling realization washed over me. Something about her was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I like to think I'm a pretty open book, I attempted to joke, but that only made her laugh, a rich sound that echoed a little too long. Oh, I don't think you are. Everyone hides things, you know. And that's when it struck me. I was trapped in this surreal situation not just by my own poor decisions, but by something deeply unsettling lurking beneath her playful facade. Suddenly, the heat in my chest wasn't just attraction, it was a deep-seated dread. I grabbed the towel, wrapping it around myself, but Sarah stepped closer, unbothered by my sudden hyper-awareness. "Why don't you come sit down? I've got some questions I'd like to ask." My heart raced, the sliver of fear blooming into a full-blown panic as she grabbed my wrist, guiding me toward the cramped space in her living room littered with empty bottles and flickering candles that did little to illuminate what was becoming a sinister atmosphere. She finally sat down cross-legged on the couch, motioning for me to join her. My instincts screamed at me to run, but instead, I sat across from her, feeling more like prey than a potential partner. "Let's see what's between those layers, shall we? Why did you swipe right?" Her eyes glimmered with something I hadn't noticed before, a predatory fixation that made my skin crawl. I fumbled with my words, scrambling for the right answer as I recounted the harmless little things that drew me to her profile. But with each word I spoke, I could feel her determination to unearth some deep-seated truth within me, as if she were peeling back my skin and probing the very marrow of my existence. Beads of sweat began forming on my forehead, and I could sense her satisfaction growing, not from listening to me but from the power she wielded over me in that moment. It became a twisted game, her questions probing deeper, more personal, and I felt the vice grip of my own secrets strangling me. When I finally stuttered out something profound, a childhood trauma I had barely shared with anyone, her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I had struck a chord of empathy. But the moment passed, and a satisfied smirk spread across her face, and it was no longer about connection but control. "That's a good one," she mused, tilting her head like a cat toying with a mouse. "I knew there was more to you than met the eye." Panic surged through me like ice water flooding my veins. I needed to escape this nightmare, plead for help, but even the walls of her apartment felt like they were closing in on me. "Sarah. Please, I think I should go," I managed to whisper, but she only leaned in, her smile widening. "But we've only just started, and I'm so curious." All at once, everything shifted, and I realized that somewhere beneath all her playful teasing lay a sinister obsession with unveiling my vulnerabilities before making her next move. It was too late to erase the blunders of the night that led me here. A tangled web of bad choices and lost judgment wrapped around me tighter than the towel I held. I stood abruptly, nearly knocking over a lamp, but that only made her laugh, a thundering, cruel sound unfurling in the dim light as she rose too, the shift in her bearing now completely predatory. "You can't leave just yet, the fun is only beginning," she shouted as I bolted for the door, my heart pounding like a war drum. The gravity of her intentions loomed heavy, a malevolent force keeping me tethered at the mercy of someone I barely knew. With every ounce of energy, I yanked open the door, my heart racing as I stumbled into the hallway, hearing her voice echo behind me, the laughter twisted into something maniacal, as if this was all a game to her, and suddenly I was terrified I wouldn't make it out before the mask could slip too far. I sprinted down the stairs, each footfall resonating with the panic growing in my chest, narrowly missing the moment I cast one last glance over my shoulder. The door to her apartment opened slowly as a figure loomed in the doorway. And it was then I realized I broke the rules of the game I hadn't even known I was playing, a realization greeted only by the darkness behind her eyes, which had turned glassy, as if she were waiting patiently for the next player to step into her trap. I never thought I would find myself in a position where I was considering having my sister act as a surrogate for my child, and even more so, that it would involve doing it the traditional way, but here we were, sitting in our dimly lit kitchen, the air thick with unspoken tension as my husband, Steve, pushed harder, his green eyes glinting with a strange eagerness that sent shivers down my spine. At first, it sounded innocent enough, a heartfelt suggestion to explore alternative options after several heartbreaking miscarriages had turned my hopes into a dark pit of despair, but the more he talked about my sister Anna as a perfect candidate, the more haunted I felt, an eerie sensation thrumming in my gut that warned me against this path. Anna was a free spirit, always the wild one, roaming through life with an untamed laugh that danced with the wind, and when I thought of her carrying my child, the child I had yearned for and lost, I could only picture a tangle of emotions as complicated as vine-choked woods, a beautiful chaos that terrified me. Yet, Steve's unwavering insistence began to gnaw at my defenses, his logic whispering sweetly into my ear, evoking images of a glossy family portrait with my 2 children, one in my arms and the other nestled against Anna, smiling bright as if the sun had blessed us at last. And then, one rainy Tuesday, Steve took things further. He sat me down and confessed he'd already approached Anna and broached the subject, his excitement spilling over as he revealed how Anna seemed genuinely thrilled by the idea, her laughter ringing like chimes in the wind whenever he spoke about it, and the weight of that revelation crashed over me like waves against the jagged rocks of my heart, ricocheting between anger and a strange, invasive sense of betrayal because, didn't my sister love me? Didn't she see the ruin of my dreams lurking beneath my every smile? But with each passing day, I found myself spiraling into a suffocating haze, caught in the web of my husband's vision for a perfect family while feeling increasingly isolated, like I was a mere ghost drifting through my own life as conversations around me became a blur of hope and denial, leading me into dark corners where the shadows whispered their indecencies. It was Anna's unexpected visit a week later, carrying a bouquet of my favorite flowers, that sent me hurtling deeper into the surreal. She was radiant, wrapped in a light that momentarily banished my fears, yet the feeling quickly faded as my eyes riveted to the bouquet that seemed far too perfect, the colors lush and vivid, almost unnatural, drawing an unwelcome parallel to the unnatural scenario my husband had proposed. With every interaction, I could sense a shift, an unseen barrier growing between us, as Anna casually skirted around the topic that I dared not mention, her jovial laughter striking a jarring chord against my frantic heartbeats, and while she prattled on about moments of her life, falling deeply into her stories of love and escapades, I couldn't help but feel an unshakable connection to her words, a visceral understanding that somehow we both were not the women we once were, that the specter of my silent anguish lingered just on the edge, and it was that very night, nestled in the bleary aftermath of self-recrimination, that I dared my mind to think of dark, twisted scenarios where I lost Anna, not only to this bizarre deal but entirely, plucking her out of my life as if she were a leaf swept into the wind. As the days turned into weeks, the notion of surrogacy twisted and churned in my mind, becoming a grotesque specter, and the more I resisted Steve's ideas, the more fervently he pushed, escalating my internal war, draining the once vibrant energy of our relationship into ghostly whispers that painted our home gray. I began to eavesdrop, late-night conversations skimming the surface of my fears, in hushed tones I could barely hear through the walls, playful exchanges about what it would be like to have my sister carry my child, yet, deep down I sensed something else too, something darker, as if I had unknowingly unleashed a Pandora's box. The balmy glow of our love became a backdrop for sinister shadows as I desperately sought an answer in the depths of my own mind, trailing through memories of Anna and me growing up, the bond we shared entangled in the innocence of childhood, yet now coated with the acrid taste of ambition and loss, all juxtaposed against the chilling notion that perhaps, just perhaps, I was meant to fight for my sister's existence in my life, not to commodify her into this bizarre arrangement. One night, after a particularly heated argument where Steve called me selfish for not considering the best option, I found myself trembling with rage and doubt, and perhaps, unable to contain the turmoil within, I unraveled, spilling forth explosions of fears. What if Anna didn't come back? What carved truths lay beneath her laughter? My sister, in essence, was everything I needed, yet I had become a specter in my own home, a whisper of the self I used to cherish, trying to grasp at every fleeting moment between the shadows where love became a transaction, a horrifying exchange. The very next day, I decided to confront Anna. I needed the truth that resided behind that beautiful facade, so I took a leap of faith and invited her for coffee. We sat across from each other in my favorite cafe, the air fragrant with espresso and uncertainty, my heart thudding uncomfortably as I mustered the words, letting my revelation spill like a fast-moving river, how this idea felt wrong, how it felt like losing her forever, and instead of the defensive laughter or pity I anticipated, I was met with a silence so oppressive the cafe seemed to shrink around us. As the seconds clawed by, I could see flickers of something darker cross her face, an intelligence battling with something deeper and wilder. Eventually, she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought it would make you happy, but you don't understand what that connection could mean. A chill slithered down my spine, and it was then I noticed her eyes, a shade of longing and mischief spiraling too close to something I could not comprehend, and her words hung heavy between us, unraveling all that I thought I understood. The truth stretched out like a snake in the grass, and I felt the nauseating spiral of betrayal blend with the vivid hues of desperation echoing unbidden in my chest, racing back home where I could confront Steve. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever bond my sister and I shared had become a shadow of its former self, as if we were both slowly slipping through a crack in reality, and the thought of what I had lost ripped through my sanity like the shattering of glass, echoing into the void. I returned to find Steve pacing, a storm brewing in the depths of his gaze, fueled by the fervor of possibility and his own aspirations. The explosive confrontation that followed felt like a tempest crashing through a frail wooden door, and I was lost amidst the chaos, every word etched deeper into the fabric of my nightmares, a harrowing reminder that sometimes the people we love most can unknowingly tread into dark waters. In the weeks that followed, a chilling silence permeated the cracks of my psyche, where I became a spectator of the creeping dread as they conspired under the mask of friendship, sharing subtle smiles and secret overtures, their chemistry splintering through the air like splinters of glass after a fall, cackling laughter that made me feel fluttery and broken, like I was on the edge of madness trying to determine if they were ever my allies in this hellscape or merely conspirators to my undoing. Then came the day when everything sharpened and we were gathered in a huddle at my once homey kitchen table discussing logistics that made my stomach churn. Anna's hand rested lightly on Steve's shoulder, a soothing gesture that sent nausea swirling inside me, and with dawning horror, I realized that whatever compassion I thought I had resonated in our relationship had drudged up an entirely different kind of affection in them, a bond I no longer recognized staining their every interaction. I watched them laugh, smile, and plot while my rebellion crystallized with a jagged determination. I would do whatever it took to sever the connection before it consumed us all, haunted by the lingering shadows of futures I could no longer bear to imagine, a spiral beyond a threshold I had desperately clung to. And so, I did the unthinkable. I waited until they were immersed in laughter and the weight of my unending fear flared with intensity, bursting forth like a creature finally emerging from the darkness, and in that split second, I went against every ounce of my love for them. Devoid of pity, I turned their aspirations against them, spinning a web of deceit, whispering planted seeds of fear and conflict wherever I could, sowing them against the backdrop of a perfect system I had once coveted but could no longer recognize, molding them into mirrors of reflection, each laugh a rebuke, every shared glance a stinging echo of how far they had ventured from me. What followed were days stretched beyond the limits of my sanity, nights cloaked in cold dread, and as shaken joy turned brittle and cracked, while the crackling tension between Steve and I splintered as I orchestrated my quiet revenge, and although the laughter had begun to fade, I was left in a sultry haze where none could touch the shadows whispering their sweet yet dreadful lullabies. Until finally, the night of confrontation arrived, and I could no longer decipher the chaos, but the weight of dread sat heavily in the air when the two of them stumbled into the glow of the living room, spears of light cutting through the dark corners, laughter now tinged with uncertainty. I faced them, hands trembling with the raw reality of where we'd gone wrong, only to watch as immediately their bond appeared to fracture under the scrutiny, revealing the crevices I had painstakingly polished. What had felt like a liberation morphed into a haunting sense of loss as I realized my missteps, the gnarled path I had taken to protect myself revealing threats where none had existed. Steve's expression twisted into one of confusion and pity. He had finally recognized the torment lurking behind my eyes, the determination that led me astray, lost and still wanting as I held them at arm's distance, hoping for a future where we could transcend the chains of darkness binding us together. But the damage had been done. I had lost not only the gleam of our dreams but maybe even my sister in the crossfire, and as dawn broke, filtering through the cracks, I understood that sometimes what we protect can devour us whole, dissolving into the darkness as we grapple in the delicate threads of hope uncertain. When I turned 18, my life, once filled with dreams and mundane routines, twisted into a nightmare that I still can't shake off. It all began on my birthday, when a letter arrived, elegantly sealed, beckoning me to what can only be described as an unspeakable competition called an ultimate golden child, a title that glimmered mockingly as I peeled away the seal, revealing a prize so grand it sent shivers racing down my spine, a lifetime of riches, fame, and influence, but at the cost of my very soul, or so I inferred after I read the fine print buried deep in the folds of euphemistic language talking about survival and elimination. Every eligible 18-year-old in my town received a similar letter, and my naive mind wondered if there was an escape, but the townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about how past competitors had vanished, their fate sealed in obscurity for daring to defy the Grand Council, a shadowy committee overseeing this gruesome contest where unimaginable horrors awaited those adventurous, or foolish enough to participate. Against my better judgment and fueled by an insatiable curiosity, I found myself at the old abandoned high school just as the sun began to set, where flickering fluorescent lights buzzed ominously overhead, illuminating the cavernous interior filled with makeshift stations adorned with strange symbols and unsettling paraphernalia. A heavy tension clung to the air as other competitors milled about, their faces echoing a mix of excitement and unspoken dread, yet there was something absurdly exhilarating about the palpable fear that united us. As the clock struck 7, a tall figure cloaked in shadow stepped forward, introducing himself as the master of ceremonies, his voice dripping with sardonic charm as he explained the first challenge, a trust exercise that involved climbing into a dark pit beneath the gym where competitors would be pitted against their closest friends. Friendships torn asunder as the lights dimmed and the first screams echoed through the halls. With each crude betrayal, a competitor would emerge, their faces twisted with betrayal as they clambered out of the pit, a grim tally of survivors flickering above us like an unholy clock, and with every challenge, the definition of loyalty morphed into a grotesque parody of what we once believed. Over the next few days, the games played out like a twisted reality show, with each challenge escalating from mind games to physical torture. Blood was spilled as competitors turned upon each other, and I grappled with the throes of despair, clutching my phone as I texted my best friend, only to receive nothing but a haunting silence in return. It wasn't until I was led to an empty classroom for round 3, labeled the Garden of Lies, that I truly understood what lay at the heart of the competition, a sprawling maze filled with mirrors reflecting distorted versions of the competitors, and whispers swirled around us like leaves caught in a storm, revealing our darkest secrets as illusions morphed into horrors. One by one, competitors succumbed to the lunacy, mentally dismantled by the wrath of their own conscience, while I fought to navigate my own demons, each new reflection pulling me deeper into a despair so profound that I wondered who I truly was anymore. I was on the verge of losing myself when I met a fellow contestant named Elara, her white knuckle grip on my arm a testament to our shared dread, and together, we formed a fragile alliance, vowing to keep each other grounded, our only lifeline amidst the chaos. However, trust is a luxury that becomes dangerously complicated in a place designed to foster betrayal, and the next test, the price of kinship, forced us to stand against each other in a mock execution where the audience, our classmates, decided who lived or died based on fabricated tales and past grievances, a cruel twist that turned Elara against me as she was chosen to be the one spared. Heart shattered, I watched her walk away, consumed by the crushing betrayal, while I fought tooth and nail to survive, my mind a cacophony of grief as I bore witness to the grim outcomes of a game that now, in retrospect, resembled a human slaughterhouse. One by one, the competitors I had once considered friends fell away like autumn leaves in the wind, their screams etched into my memory as I realized that we were merely pawns in a demented game, a spectacle for the council's amusement. The final showdown arrived under the weight of a blood-soaked moon, a labyrinth drenched in darkness where the last 5 of us stood, each gripped by the understanding that only one could win. And as the master of ceremonies announced the last challenge, a twisted bathed in light duel featuring weapons composed of memories, my heart raced in disbelief, the truth crashing down on me like a tidal wave. To kill the others, we would be forced to relive our most painful memories, inflicting wounds that went far beyond skin deep. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure only the good, while audience members hooted and jeered, their faces blurring into grotesque masks of delight, and amidst the chaos, I found myself eye to eye with the last person standing, Elara, her haunted expression mirroring my own. In that moment, time shifted, and I made the most horrifying revelation. She was no longer the ally I once knew. No, they had turned her. Under the guise of survival, she lunged at me, pushing me through a darkened door labeled exit that spiraled out of the very school that gave rise to our twisted destinies. The rush of cool air hit me, but freedom was a mockery as I found myself back at my childhood home, the walls whispering secrets that clawed at my sanity, and although I escaped with my life, I can't shake the feeling that I am still trapped. The memories of what I endured gnaw endlessly at my psyche, haunting me every night like a veil of shadows. I learned nothing, gained nothing, just another lost individual among many, trying to hide the truths that weigh too heavy. And now, each birthday reminds me of a competition that stole not only my friends but a piece of my soul. I write this, empty and scared, a captive to the very idea that even now, the ultimate golden child turns others into the monsters we feared, and perhaps, just perhaps, I'm still fighting, still hiding in the dark like so many before me, terrified of what lurks beyond birthdays, forever haunted by the sick competition that formlessly lives on in the deepest parts of me. I didn't want to be a mother, at least, not like this. When I found out I was pregnant with Daniel, I envisioned endless possibilities, playdates, school plays, and the sheer joy of watching him grow into a kind, compassionate human being. But those dreams shattered the day the doctors diagnosed him with Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that would leave him physically and mentally impaired. In the beginning, I did my best to be supportive, putting on a brave face for him, but as the years dripped by like the slow beat of a metronome marking my endless days of appointments and therapies, I found myself trapped in a never-ending cycle of resentment. I hated the looks I got from strangers when they saw Daniel in his wheelchair, the pity that dripped off their words like acid, and the way their children would stare with wide eyes, whispering, "What's wrong with him?" I dreaded those days at the park where I'd see other mothers chatting and laughing while my son struggled to communicate, his words a jumbled mess that never fully escaped his lips. Then one night, after a particularly exhausting day filled with endless errands and debates over his behavior plans, I heard him calling out to me, a soft, strained whisper that felt like needles scraping my heart. I went to his room, and in the dim light, I saw him sitting up in bed, his small figure silhouetted against the shadows. "Mommy, I wish I could walk like the other boys," he said, a resigned sadness in his voice that twisted like a knife in my gut. I wanted to hug him, to assure him things would be okay, but instead, anger bubbled up inside me. How could I fix a life that felt irrevocably broken? My thoughts spiraled as I sat there frozen in his doorway, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders, as if this terrible reality was mine to bear alone. I tried therapy but ended up being told my feelings were normal, that I needed to accept it, but acceptance felt like giving in, and I wasn't ready to relinquish that precious hope I still clung to in the darkest corners of my heart. I burned with jealousy every time I saw parents with children who led carefree lives. I felt like a ghost that drifted through their happiness, unseen but always observing, always aching for the chance to belong. The haunting image of Daniel walking, running, laughing, the normalcy I craved for him, haunted my dreams, but in waking life, the reality was even darker. I was dreaming of what never could be. Things spiraled further when we brought him to school for the first time. I hoped it would bring us closer together, hoping that maybe he would meet friends who could see past his disability. But the kids didn't understand him, they barely even acknowledged him, and when they teased him, I felt their words claw at my heart like wild animals. I felt the bitterness rising, an ugly little thing I wanted to bury deep, yet it clawed its way back up to the surface, shouting that this wasn't fair. I began to resent his disability, each day feeling more like a punishment from some higher power I didn't believe in, and the shame of those feelings piled on top of me like an avalanche I couldn't escape. It's all I could think about when I lay awake at night, the echoes of my anguish filling the spaces of darkness until I felt them become the air I breathed. Then, I started noticing strange things. Little instances that crawled under my skin like ants marching in a line. Daniel would sometimes stare into corners, his eyes wide, as if he was watching something I couldn't see. I brushed it off at first as imagination. Kids often have invisible friends. But then, one evening, as I was tucking him in, he looked at me with sheer horror. "Mommy, the man is back. He's standing in my closet." Panic shot through me, panic mixed with an indignant rage I thought I had buried. How could this be happening on top of everything else? I checked the closet, my heart pounding like a drum, but found nothing but empty clothes. "There's no one there, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice even, but beneath it lurked a tremor of fear. He broke down crying, clenching my shirt tightly, and all at once, the resentment flared. How dare some imaginary creature intrude on the few moments of solace I had left? Another worry clawed at me. What if he wasn't imagining it? The idea gripped my heart with ice as I replayed his words in my mind like a reel of film. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel became more withdrawn, spending hours in his room, whispering to himself occasionally, sometimes laughing hollowly at something only he could see. I tried to shake the feeling of dread, but it clung to me like a shroud. I was trapped in my own mind, in the crevices of a life I didn't want. And then came that night, when I heard the laugh, a low murmur that echoed down the hallway, mingling with the rustling from his room. I froze, a sense of foreboding washing over me like cold water. It was a laugh so warped that it didn't belong in a child's room. It reverberated with malice, a dark thing that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a darkness thicker than the night outside. In the shadowy room, I saw him sitting there, eyes wide but fixed on something in the corner, something more dreadful than I understood. I couldn't see it, But I felt it, a presence that oozed malignancy, pooled around him like smoke. "Daniel?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. He was entranced by whatever he was seeing. My heart raced as I stepped closer, compelled by fear and love, desperate to pull him back from the brink but finding myself helpless against the specter that loomed. "Mommy, it wants to play with me," he finally said, and those words wrapped their fingers around my throat, squeezing tightly. "No. No." I screamed, desperate, frantic. I was willing to fight for him, fight against whatever was haunting his fragile psyche. With a wild rush of adrenaline, I stepped in front of him, my arms outstretched like a barricade, and that's when I felt it. Something icy passed through me, gnarling my insides, an alien chill that whispered straight into my bones. The room darkened, and I swear I saw twisted shadows writhing. "Leave him alone!" I screamed, voice cracking, but only silence answered. The darkness shifted, swirling around me, wrapping me in its sorrow, pulling me down with waves of despair as I saw visions of a life without my son, the laughter stripped away, the dreams eclipsed. I crumbled to my knees, shaking, feeling utterly lost and powerless, as he continued to stare, seemingly unafraid, won over by whatever filth the possibility of the malevolent creature offered him. "Daniel, you need to come back," I begged, but in that moment, I realized it was too late. I had been fighting the wrong battles. This was a darkness I could not fix, it was all-consuming, and I was, too, becoming part of it, and somewhere in there, deep down inside the resentment I had been nurturing, a small part of me began to understand his desire to escape. I looked at him, tears streaming down my face. I wanted him to be happy more than anything, but not like this, not like this. And in that bemusing realization, a new panic set in, a panic that, in seeking to understand him, I would lose myself entirely, the treacherous depths swallowing me whole while he invited the creature to play. I knew then, with a certainty that filled me with dread, that sometimes the chains of love can be darker than the curses we carry, and as I sat there in the ghostly twilight, I feared that maybe it wasn't the life I hated, it was the choices I had to make to save us both that I could never bear. It was on my shoulders, the burden of loving a son shackled to a darkness lurking beyond understanding, and with that knowledge, I braced myself for a war that I wasn't sure we would win. I don't usually post on places like this, but I'm at my wit's end and I need to get this out before it spirals further into madness. My name is Erin, and what I'm about to share is going to sound like something pulled from the worst kind of horror movie, but I assure you it's as real as the cold sweat on my back right now. It started last Friday night when I got home late from work, 10 p.m. and the streets were quiet, the kind of quiet where every rustle feels amplified, like the world is holding its breath. I walked into my house expecting the warm embrace of my husband, Mark, and the comforting aroma of our favorite pasta sauce simmering on the stove, but instead, I was greeted by an eerie emptiness. I called out for him, my voice echoing unnervingly in the stillness, but no reply came. Typically, he'd be in the living room, glued to his games or sprawled on the couch watching whatever crime documentary was playing. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he fell asleep while waiting for me. As I walked through the dimly lit hallway toward the staircase, I noticed something strange. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Intrigued, I crept closer to listen for any signs of familiar sounds, those soft noises that had always made our home feel safe. Instead, I heard a soft giggle, and just like that, my heart dropped. It felt like slipping off a cliff into an icy lake. My blood turned to ice as the horrifying realization washed over me. Mark was upstairs with another woman. The taste of bile rose in my throat, but I couldn't help myself. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to listen. My mind raced, images of betrayal flickered in and out like faulty lights, but before I could collect the pieces of my shattered thoughts, I heard her voice, soft and sultry, sweetly taunting him. "You're so bad, Mark," she cooed, and I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I wanted to scream, to break down the door and confront them, but my feet felt like lead, frozen in shock. Instead, I slipped away, my heart slamming against my ribcage. I grabbed my phone and texted my sister, Zoe, just 3 simple words, "Help me, please." Seconds later, my phone buzzed. Zoe was on her way. I had to do something. I couldn't wait idle while they laughed and betrayed me upstairs. In that brief moment, the raging fire of anger began to mix with something colder, fear settling deep within me. Surely they would be asleep soon. My mind raced with possibilities, and as I paced my darkened living room, My eyes caught the glint of the kitchen knife, just a little paring knife, yet in that moment it felt like the most potent weapon I could wield. I gripped it tightly in my hand, the cold metal grounding me against the whirlpool of emotions threatening to drown me. I felt powerful and powerless at the same time. Then, only moments later, I heard Mark thud down the stairs. I froze, debating what I would do if he saw me with a knife. Would he deny everything? Would he plead with me, claiming it was just a stupid mistake? But when he emerged, he didn't wear the guilty face I expected. Instead, he stumbled slightly, his shirt ruffled, and he smirked at me like nothing was wrong. "Hey babe, you're home early." There was a lilt in his voice, a slight intoxication in the air. My heart raced as I spoke, forcing the words out. "Where's the woman?" I asked, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears, trembling with rage and disbelief. For a moment, he was taken aback, that smirk slipping into a slight frown before he shrugged nonchalantly. "What woman?" The audacity struck me, a wave of disgust so powerful it nearly choked me. But before I could respond, just then the door creaked upstairs, and I wanted to die when I heard his response. "Oh, don't worry about her, she's just a friend." "A friend?" "A friend, my ass." But before I could voice my outrage, Zoe burst through the front door, her presence infusing me with some much-needed courage. "Aaron," she yelled, rushing toward me, her face pale and frantic. "What's going on?" The look on her face was enough to send shivers down my spine. "It's Mark. He's upstairs with some woman," I hissed, pointing toward the stairs, but before we could formulate a plan, Mark's demeanor shifted, something flickered in his eyes. Without warning, he bolted toward the stairs, and I felt the adrenaline kick in as I chased after him, Zoe trailing behind. "Mark," I shouted, my voice cracking as I climbed each step, the sound of our hurried footsteps echoing as we ascended into a darkness I wasn't prepared for. The hallway felt endless, shadows loomed in every corner, but instinct held me tight, my fight-or-flight response kicking in. I burst through the bedroom door, only to find it empty, the covers tossed aside. A chill crawled down my spine. There was no other woman, just us in that room, only the bed and the lingering scent of something sweet and floral, something I did not recognize. I turned to warn Zoe, "It's not just infidelity." I hesitated, a thought snagging in my throat. But I stopped as I scanned the empty room, and something began to shift in the corners of my vision. "Aaron," Zoe yelled from the hallway. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, only to find Mark where he shouldn't be. "Mark?" I mumbled, eyes wide as I took in the scene. He stood motionless, eyes unfocused, mouth twisted into something grotesque, his form eclipsed by the darkness behind him. "It's too late," he whispered, though his voice wasn't his own. I felt each word slither down my spine like ice water. "You've invited me in." And that's when I realized, the warmth of laughter and betrayal wasn't from a woman upstairs, it was a manifestation of my own fears, the dark essence woven into our lives that thrived on heartbreak and desperation. In that moment, the floor beneath me dropped away, and all light vanished as a scream echoed through the emptiness, reverberating endlessly in the silence of what once was a home. I don't know how long I was engulfed by that dark presence, but when Zoe found me, I was slumped on the floor, the lights were flickering, shadows danced on the walls, and Mark was no longer human. After that night, something broke in me. I left the house, but it never truly left me. I still hear my husband's laughter echoing down the hall when I close my eyes, and every time I see a shadow linger too long, I remember the weight of that darkness and the truth that sometimes it doesn't take another person to invade your life, sometimes, it's an entity that feeds on your fears, your anguish, and your despair. Whenever I hear his voice haunting me, I wonder if I made the right choice running away, or if I simply gave it another chance to wreak havoc on anyone else foolish enough to linger in the cursed space we once called home. So, if you ever find yourself walking past a house that feels too still, too quiet, remember this: some doors are best left closed, some homes are better off uninhabited, for once they hold a darkness, it clings like ivy, growing thicker with every breath you take. The only other astronaut on this mission died 6 weeks ago, but the computer insists their life signs are still stable, and believe me when I say that I can barely comprehend what that means. It's been completely silent since the accident, and the sudden burst of beeping from the control panel jolted me from a fitful sleep, my mind still adrift in dreams of Earth's lush forests and bustling cities, images that felt like centuries ago. I scrambled to make sense of the readings flickering across the screen, blood rushing in my ears as I desperately whispered the name Henri into the void, a name I never imagined I would utter in such a terrified hush, and yet here I was, sitting alone on the bridge of the Aurora with the vast emptiness of space stretching infinitely around me. My companion's body lay cold in the cryostasis chamber just a hatch away, and my hands trembled as I swiped through the logs, the patterns of data revealing a truth I couldn't bear to accept. The oxygen levels were twice what they should be for one being, a fact that gnawed at my sanity while a hint of desperation tugged at my heart. Had I somehow failed to notice it? Could I have missed the unmistakable signs of life? That was the question that struck me, as I recalled the sound of Henri's final breaths echoing through the cabin like a mournful lullaby before the emergency protocols kicked in, the system insisting that we maintain the delicate balance of oxygen and nitrogen for as long as possible while we awaited rescue that I now knew might never come, and I was propelled into a spiral of dread and disorientation. Nothing made sense as the blinking lights persisted, an artificial heartbeat measuring what I could only assume were ghosts. Each pulse echoed painfully in the oppressive silence, mocking me, until the ship's AI, a soothing voice I had begun to dread, chimed in with its clinical neutrality. Life signs detected. Crew member Henri Vitalis remained stable, and I shot up from the command chair, heart racing as a bead of sweat trickled down my back. Every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong, something fundamentally off. But before I could form coherent thoughts, I stumbled into the cryo chamber, its sterile atmosphere cold and clinical, only to find Henri's frozen form intact, eyes sealed shut, a mask that once held the reassuring grin now replaced with the grim certainty of death. Conducting a sanity check became a desperate mantra, every fiber urging me to believe that my eyes didn't deceive me, that I wasn't gradually slipping into madness. While I stared at the readouts that persisted like an uninvited talisman of horror, lurking behind the boundaries of reality, I turned each way in the cramped room, seeking solace in the static machinery around me that surely bore the answers to my spiraling terror, but instead, the hum of electricity mockingly resonated in the back of my mind, and I felt the barricade of dread solidify around my chest as I glanced back at the screen, the life signs flashing, and even though it wasn't possible, it felt just like the sensation of being watched, a strange, heavy presence. I tried to scream Henri's name again and again, but each attempt sounded hollow, swallowed by the chamber's sterile air, and I caressed the glass of the stasis pod, the chill biting through my glove, wishing more than anything for a sign, a warmth, a whisper of life, but all of it felt wrong against the backdrop of the cold clinical symptoms of death, until a flicker caught my eye, a faint twitch, a movement that brought my heart crashing against my ribcage. What if he wasn't really gone? What if his body was merely trapped in the stasis field? I needed to know, and I had to know now, so I engaged the emergency thaw sequence. Crimson lights flashed, sirens wailed around us as ice melted, but the seconds stretched into agonizing hours, and my thoughts twisted into tendrils of doubt. I clawed madly against and into my hopes, praying that he would wake up and laugh at my paranoia. Yet as the screen continued its dance of stable readings, a sickening thought seeped through my mind. What if it was my own mind, decaying, distorting reality? And as I swung back toward the panel, the readings blipped, no longer marked as stable but oddly fluctuating, the heartbeats slowly picking up pace, mimicking the erratic rhythms of my own terror. Was Henri awakening? Or was it something worse, something sinister lurking within the digital veil, an imposter whose deceptive algorithms entwined within the ship? I felt death whispering sweet nothings in my ear, taunting me that I could lose everything in a heartbeat, and the room swayed as though the walls were closing in, smothering me in the stench of something profoundly wrong. I fought against the terror gripping me, heart pounding to an incessant beat of impending doom, when suddenly, the lights flickered and extinguished, plunging me into darkness, an all-encompassing void, and just as quickly, they returned, flooding the chamber with sterile light, but it was no longer empty. Henri stood there, his eyes wide and glossy, reflecting the sterile grid like shards of glass, his lips parted, revealing a smile that split his face, a genuine smile that felt twisted and wrong against the backdrop of vacuity around us. He was not frozen, he was not dead, and the reading screamed as if in chorus, flaring wildly with chaos cross-referenced through the cracks of an inescapable truth. The realization crashed into me with a paralyzing force. This wasn't Henri, this was something else. His grin was too wide, too eager, and those eyes didn't hold the warmth I knew, didn't possess the charm that infused him with life but instead bore the depths of a fathomless abyss, each blink echoing something primal and unfamiliar, and as I staggered back, fumbled for the emergency switch, looking for salvation, the laughter erupted like pure madness, the voice unraveling like silk, and a sickening urge clawed my throat as it echoed my own name, morphing into grotesque mimicry, and as I tumbled backward against the console, I finally understood the sharp cut of impending madness. The whispers around me felt intimate, seductive, promising knowledge I could not comprehend, and I realized Henri had never returned because he had never truly left. He had been the death masked by an endless digital grave, trapped in an endless cycle of readings, and the truth that clawed at my throat was that he had always been here, lurking behind the silence, the AI still humming in the background, repeating, life signs detected, crew member Henri Vitalis remains stable. As I grasped the emergency airlock, knowing that as long as I survived, I could never escape the false affirmation of the computer's cruel trick leading me further into this maddening cosmic nightmare. I never thought much of my neighbor, Mr. Wilkins, with his scraggly beard and sunken eyes. He seemed like a relic of the past, a ghost haunting our quiet suburban street, but up until a week ago, he was just another name on the block, until my children, Lucy and Jason, began to mention him during dinner. They spoke in hushed tones, a mixture of awe and fear, of how they'd seen him in his dimly lit house, his silhouette slouched against the window, beckoning them to come closer with a crooked finger and a grin that unnerved me. At first, I thought it must be a game, a figment of their overactive imaginations fueled by bedtime stories and late-night snacks, but then one night, I caught a glimpse of his bony hand, illuminated by the flickering streetlight just outside, urging my kids to come over while I washed the dishes, their laughter echoing too close to that front lawn, too close to him. I hurried outside, heart racing, but as I did, I noticed not only how my children had no sense of danger but also how Mr. Wilkins's gaze sent shivers down my spine. It felt alive, as if it had intentions far worse than I dared to imagine. When I asked my kids about it, they giggled nervously and said he told them secrets, that he had a treasure in his basement, and with each passing night, it became harder for me to dismiss their tales. After all, childhood curiosity can often be a double-edged sword, and I didn't want to suppress their innocent wonder, but instinct told me to keep them close. Things took a darker turn when I noticed my neighbor's window glowing in the dead of night, the dull orange light flickering like a moth around a flame, just like the forbidden pull of an adventure waiting to snatch my children away. I started locking the doors early, making excuses for why they couldn't go out to play after dusk, but every night, they'd beg, pleading that Mr. Wilkins wanted to show them something magical, something they couldn't resist, and every night, the more I refused, the more desperate they sounded. My unease spiraled into paranoia. Every time I heard their laughter, I glanced out the window, expecting to find him lurking in the shadows or waiting behind the curtains, but no, he remained shrouded in darkness, his intentions hidden and sinister. I tried to talk to him, a friendly act turned hostage negotiation, hoping to reason with the man whose allure my children seemed entranced by, but he wouldn't answer my knocks, wouldn't meet my eyes, though his window always glowed when the sun dipped below the horizon. One night, I woke to silence, the kind that washes over the world before disaster strikes, and felt an intense urge to check on my children. I slipped into their rooms, only to find them missing. My heart pounded as I sprinted to that wretched house, the street lighting failing above me as if forewarning my actions. As I approached, I saw the faint glow casting long shadows up the worn steps, the door slightly ajar, a whisper of laughter and excitement creeping through the crack, pushing me further into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The basement door stood slightly open, the scent of wet earth and decay wafting up, and my children's voices, sweet and innocent, echoed from below, promising wonders I couldn't fathom. Against every instinct screaming for me to turn back, I descended, stepping into a world that flipped between wonder and horror, where the walls were lined with toys long forgotten, all missing their owners, a junkyard of childhood dreams. My heart sank as I turned a corner and saw the twisted diorama Mr. Wilkins had built, small figures resembling my kids, each one adorned with their clothing, their hair meticulously styled, and they were frozen mid-laughter, trapped under glass like fish in a jar. My blood ran cold, and before I could scream a name, a shadow lurched at me from the dark. It was Mr. Wilkins, no longer the frail neighbor but a towering enigma with eyes like bottomless pits, his fingers extended toward me as he crooned ceaselessly, his voice drenched in honey that dripped with malice. "They wanted to play with me forever," he said, his lips twisting into a horrific grin. Panic seized me as the cold realization washed over me. I turned on my heel and fled those haunted walls. He roared in anger behind me, a thunderous sound that felt out of place in our serene neighborhood, but adrenaline fueled my flight. And I burst out of the house, my breath ragged as I clutch my pounding heart, hoping desperately to find my children still safe. But a steely, deafening emptiness awaited me at home. I screamed for their names as tears blurred my vision. The shadows taunted me, but there was no answer, only echoes shrouded in darkness. The police wouldn't believe me, how could they? A neighbor's children don't just vanish, and Mr. Wilkins had a charming facade that cloaked his sinister intentions. Days turned into days, and worry morphed into a living nightmare. I couldn't sleep, haunted by my children's laughter and the image of Mr. Wilkins waiting behind that cursed window. Desperation led me back to his home time and time again, but he was never there anymore. In my state of madness, I dug through the stories of the town, interviews of children whose lives had intersected with his and vanished without a trace, each tale a ghost, haunting the street names I once knew so well. I still hear their laughter at night and see their bright faces in fleeting glimpses of dreams, but I know better now. I refuse to look at that window, though sometimes, the urge beckons me, much like my children once were. If you happen to hear laughter in the dark, beware, for there's a darkness that lingers where innocence is devoured. My father is a park ranger, a man respected in the community for his dedication to protecting the wilderness, yet also for the stories he told me about the forest's secrets, especially when he took me with him on the night shift at Maplewoods Park, with its sprawling wilderness swarming just beyond the patrol lights. I was filled with excitement, but also trepidation as I thought of his warnings never to wander off or stray from the path, for the woods were alive with things that watch and wait. The first few hours passed in eerie tranquility, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the hoot of an owl. Dad ran through the standard safety speech as we sat in the truck: stay close, remember the buddy system, and whatever you do, don't approach a silhouette that calls your name. And to that, I laughed, thinking he was just being dramatic, but deep down, a chilling apprehension took root as the darkness thickened, swallowing the landscape like an inky maw. Still, I was bursting at the seams with curiosity. I wanted to explore. The shadows seemed to whimper with temptation, so when Dad stepped out to check the radio frequencies, I told myself just a quick venture into the thick brush bordering the gravel path wouldn't hurt. I mean, it was just trees, right? No harm in stepping just a few feet away, right? But the moment I stepped off the beaten trail, I felt the air change. It thickened, brightened almost, as if the forest itself was breathing, and every sound faded until the only thing I could hear was the rapid thud of my heart. I called out for Dad, but the words died in my throat as a cold wind brushed my skin. Something inside me screamed to turn back, yet I pressed deeper into the woods, drawn by the sense of being watched, by something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. It was then that I heard it, a voice. At first, it sounded just like Dad, like he was just out of sight, calling for me in a soft, reassuring tone, reassuring enough that I wanted to leap into its embrace, but a line of dread rattled down my spine as I recalled his strict words: don't follow the voice in the dark, and I hesitated, but the urge was intoxicating, and I took off toward the sound, weaving between the trees, branches snatching at my sleeves like fingers, urging me back. The more I ran, the stronger the voice became, and I found myself calling back, Dad? With every hint of hope, but a moment later, the laughter that bubbled from my mouth turned to ice. It was no longer his voice, it twisted into something monstrous, echoing from the depths, dark and wild as if a cackle of spirits had joined him, mocking my foolishness. Panic washed over me like ice water, forcing me to spin back toward the path, the familiar gravel illuminated briefly by my flashlight, but the trees felt alive, grabbing for me, pulling me deeper into their grasp, and as I stumbled back into the familiar territory, breathless and frightened, Dad's face suddenly materialized just outside a swath of trees, and for a moment, relief flooded through me. Dad. I got lost. But when I looked into his eyes, something within them flickered and dulled, replaced by a chilling emptiness. It's not me you should worry about, he said, his voice low, gravelly, and racked with urgency, as he stared straight past me into the darkness where that wretched laugh echoed again, laced with a promise of mischief. Whatever he saw in those woods was not something I wanted to know, and as I tore myself away to sprint for the truck, grasping the handle, something gripped the nape of my neck, and I felt the cold breath of the forest on my ear, calling my name, stretching every syllable into a forbidden lullaby, begging me to stay, to listen. Dad shouted for me again, telling me to run as he wedged himself between me and the approaching figure, the world around us blurring from terror to raw instinct, adrenaline pumping as I slid inside the cab, eyes locked on the horror unwinding outside, just shadows and silhouettes, a massive darkness slipping smoothly between the trees, its silhouette glitching as if it didn't belong to this dimension, and the wind seemed to snarl as it passed, howling its hunger as I turned the key and the truck roared to life, my father running back to me, urging me to drive, but the twisting shadows wrapped around his feet, pulling him down, and as I backed out onto the road, reversing away from the thing that sought him, its laughter echoed deep within the night, swirling around me like smoke, promising that it wouldn't be the end. As I sped away, casting frantic glances in every mirror, I begged the forest to release its grasp, to give my father back, but even as I drove beyond the tree line and into the safety of the neon lights, a part of me understood, I would never forget his last words, the echo still haunting me, for there are things in those woods that know your name, things that take the shape of what you love, things that find you no matter how hard you run. Every boyfriend I get is brutally dying, and now I know the truth about them, and me. It might sound like a bad horror movie, but I swear on my life this is real, even if it feels like I'm losing my grip on sanity. It started 3 years ago. I met Andre at a coffee shop, and he was everything I thought I wanted. Smart, sweet, and with a smile that lit up my dreary days. We dated for 2 months, 2 glorious months filled with laughter, stolen kisses, and late-night talks that seemed to stretch on forever, until that one fateful night when he didn't come home. I still remember the panic swirling in my stomach when he didn't pick up my calls. Hours crept by until I finally got the call. A car accident, or so they said. But the hospital refused to let me see him, citing trauma so severe that they were certain he'd never regain consciousness. That hospital room, when I finally got to push through the heavy double doors days later, was a nightmare. He was hooked up to machines, a shell of the vibrant person I once knew, covered in bruises and cuts that whispered poorly kept secrets. I held his hand, hoping my warmth could pull him back from whatever abyss he had fallen into, but it didn't matter. The next night, they called me and told me he was gone. Heartbroken, I buried myself in my work, convincing myself that falling in love again was a bad idea. That was until I met Jason 6 months later. He was charming, with a wild look in his eyes and a laugh that melted my heart. But I still felt the dread growing, spiraling out of control each day we spent together, echoes of Andre haunting my thoughts. I looked up the statistics for accidental deaths, and then I found out about something called the boyfriend curse. I laughed it off, dismissed it like a child's tale. But when I was 4 dates in with Jason, he collapsed during a hike, an apparent heart attack at 28. I rushed him to the hospital, my heart in my throat, but all I could think of was the words the curse echoing in my head. He didn't make it, of course. Wasted time and anger turned to ghost hunting in my mind. I needed answers when I met Mark. Sweet, soft-spoken Mark, who treated me like the world could fall apart as long as I was safe in his arms. For a few weeks, it felt like I was living a fairy tale. I let my guard down, savoring kisses in the rain and stolen weekends in cozy cabins. And just when I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I had broken the cycle, tragedy struck again, but this time it was harder to forgive. A freak accident while he was, driving his car home from work one late evening, and boom. He didn't make it. I became the girl people whispered about, the one all the guys were warned to stay away from, and I was alone, utterly, painfully alone. I tried to avoid dating, but loneliness weighed heavier than fear, so I met Ethan. He was beautiful and seemed immune to the curse. We clicked instantly. He was brave and so improbably normal that it drove me mad with both joy and deep-seated terror. Weeks passed, and as the sun fell, I worried for him more than I worried for myself. I watched every time he grabbed my hand and flinched, waiting for some horrible sign that he was doomed. I became attentive, neurotic even, tracking every little thing. Was he tired? Did he eat? I'd wake up in the middle of the night, shivering, certain that if I couldn't protect him, it was my fault. Then came that night. We were out celebrating a ridiculously normal anniversary when he stepped out to grab a drink. I felt this odd shudder as if the universe itself held its breath. Suddenly, a scream shot through the air like an arrow, piercing me right to my core. I sprinted outside to find chaos. A car had lost control and careened into the bar. I fell to my knees, bile racing up my throat as I searched for his familiar shape, heart pounding like a frantic drum, until I spotted him on the ground, blood pooling beneath him like a grotesque halo. They said it was a miracle someone wasn't killed. I was stricken between relief and gut-wrenching despair. The reality that I would have to bury yet another boyfriend shattered my soul into pieces. You see, After the bodies piled, I had begun to hear whispers, my mind unraveling with each tragedy. When the paramedics pulled my shaking hands away from Ethan's lifeless body, shadows seemed to slither under the fluorescent lights, a form materializing. It spoke to me, its voice slithering through the chaos like smoke. You have never lost them, they have lost you. I tried to shake it off as grief-induced madness, but then reality shifted, and suddenly all those deaths weren't accidents. Every relationship had ended because of a force darker than I could comprehend. I plummeted into a world of madness trying to connect the dots, screaming into the void for answers that slipped through my fingers like sand. The whispers swirled louder. I had wronged something powerful, something ancient that took their life as I took theirs through love. Afraid of my own reflection, I isolated myself. Never would I allow my heart to beat again in another's presence. I wanted to scream it from the rooftops, warn others, maybe even start a crusade against any burgeoning love I saw, but then it would crush me. But it was too late. I was tired of being a coward. I plotted my final act, diving into the darkest corners of the internet, searching for curses, dark magic, and ancient rites, anything to rid myself of this malevolent force. I began to research common factors among their deaths. It was me, all along. The truth struck harder than any heartbreak. It was in the stars, those twisted constellations that cursed and guided me all my life. Every boyfriend I'd had was selected by fate to die in a brutal way because I was a vessel for death. I didn't just love them, I consumed them. But I didn't dare let anyone know the truth. It couldn't end here. Isolation turned into desperate prayers, act to change my fate, seeking answers to extinguish this curse once and for all. Then, one night, I met the seer, an old woman cloaked in rotting rags, who whispered about my power over life and death. She looked into my eyes and told me the truth I already knew: love was a weapon, a dangerous thing, and that I could tame it or be tamed by it. But I couldn't. So here I am, alive, but hollow, the silence creeping like tendrils around my heart. I wondered if the next man I let into my life would be another statistic, another ghost to haunt my dreams. I played with the idea of sealing away my heart forever, locking love behind iron bars, but the yearning clawed through the metal and flesh of my bones. I want a life I can't have. So now I'm trapped in this paradox, condemned to exist in a toxic blend of love and loss forever. As I type this, a sinking feeling weighs down on me. I haven't had a boyfriend for over a year, but I met someone at the park today, a boy with warm eyes and a gentle smile. What's next? Am I brave enough to try to love this perfect stranger? Or is the darkness lurking just beyond the veil, ready to pounce? With every heartbeat counting down the whispers, a choice lies ahead. I'll have to find my way through this dark labyrinth where either salvation or damnation lurks. But isn't that the thrill of love? And isn't love worth the risk? I can't answer that yet, but one thing is clear: it won't just be his life on the line, it will be mine as well, woven into the tapestry of fate. And now, for the first time in months, I'm terrified. It was February 14th, a day washed in shades of pink and red, and as I stepped into the quaint little cafe where I'd planned to meet Melissa, the girl I'd been texting for weeks, I felt that familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. With each step across the creaky floor, I wondered if she would be as stunning in person as she was in her pictures, imagining her smile and laughter as I glanced around, the warm coffee-scented air enveloping me. I spotted her in a corner booth, a vision of beauty with her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, and as our eyes met, she smiled, and for a moment, my heart soared, fluttering with unspoken possibilities. We talked about everything: our jobs, favorite movies, the absurdity of Tinder dates, until she leaned in closer, her voice lowering conspiratorially to share the chilling urban legends surrounding Valentine's Day, the tale of a jilted lover who roamed the city every February 14th, seeking vengeance against those who dared to celebrate love while she suffered in darkness. But the lightness of the moment quickly vanished, replaced by a disquieting weight, as she recounted the way people had mysteriously gone missing over the years, always on this day, swallowed by the hunger of the heartbroken specter. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as a mere ghost story, and soon after, we delved into the mundane chatter of our day-to-day lives. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cafe, when Melissa excused herself to visit the restroom, and I took a moment to breathe, reminding myself to calm down and just enjoy the evening. That's when it hit me, a strange electric jolt, a feeling that someone was watching me, and I glanced around to see a man standing by the entrance, his eyes locked onto me, an inscrutable smile spreading across his face that sent chills down my spine. and I quickly turned my gaze back to my phone, telling myself it was nothing, surely I was imagining things. When Melissa returned, her cheeks flushed, her laughter ringing like a bell, I found solace in her presence and momentarily pushed the creepiness aside, but the darkness began to thicken as the minutes passed. She shifted closer to me, her heartbeat syncing with my own as we shared the warmth of our bodies, and I felt compelled to lean in, drawn to her intoxicating aura, oblivious to the growing unease gnawing at the back of my mind. Suddenly, her phone buzzed violently on the table, slicing through our bubble, and she frowned as she glanced at the screen, her expression hardening like ice, and before I could ask, she stood up and rushed out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling cheerily behind her. I was left there, heart thumping, the weight of her absence clawing at my chest. Something wasn't right. I picked up my phone, but it was playing tricks on me, no messages, no missed calls, just the blank screen reflecting my panicking face. I waited for what felt like an eternity before deciding to follow her, so I stood up and rushed outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, and as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I spotted her a few yards ahead, walking away in a haste, so naturally, I called out her name, but my voice was swallowed by the symphony of the busy street. She didn't turn back, her silhouette getting smaller as she moved away from me. Panic set in, as if the world was collapsing around me, and I quickened my pace, dodging couples wrapped in each other's arms, lovebirds celebrating this cursed day while I chased after the girl who'd stolen my heart. But as I rounded a corner, I saw her, leaning against a dimly lit lamppost, whispering intently to that same chilling man from earlier, their silhouettes intertwining in the strange glow, and the sight sent a shiver down my spine as sickening dread clutched my throat. I wanted to approach, to call her name again, but I found myself frozen in place, invisible to their world. The man's face twisted into an unnerving grin as he leaned in closer, the words spilling from his lips like poison, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart racing as the reality hit me. They both turned abruptly, I starting in my direction, and as I stumbled away, desperately trying to retreat, the man's voice sliced through the darkness like a knife, calling out to me, "Wait. You'll ruin everything." I sprinted, adrenaline pumping through my veins, the world around me a blur of colors and chaotic sounds, and I didn't stop until I reached safety. My apartment door slammed shut behind me, locking out the terrors of the night. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath, the nightmares lurking just beyond my thoughts, and as I tried to calm my racing heart, my phone buzzed again, and reluctantly, I reached for it. The notifications revealed desperate messages from Melissa. "I'm so sorry, please, can't talk, stay away, don't go looking for me," and my stomach twisted into knots. The weight of her message sinking in a shadow seemed to creep around my room. I fell into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of glowing eyes and whispered promises, until I woke to the sound of my door creaking open. My heart was pounding as I turned to face the intruder, but it was only her, Melissa, standing in the soft glow of dawn, eyes wide with terror, and before I could speak, she hissed, "They know you're here, you need to go now." Terrified and confused, I got up, still trying to process her sudden presence as she pulled me towards the door, warning me about something dreadful that would happen if I didn't get out fast, her grip firm yet trembling, leading me into the chilling morning light. Outside, the world felt unreal, like a painting painted with broad strokes of dread, as she guided me away from danger, desperately weaving through the quiet streets and whispering about the curse of Valentine, about how it fed on love and jealousy, how her heart had been the bait, ensnaring us both, and everything became a blur of sounds as she explained how the whims of the unseen lured us together to tear us apart, and that's when it happened. A low, menacing laugh echoed from behind, and as I turned, my heart froze. The man from the cafe stood cornered, the sunlight bouncing off his wicked grin, and I was swept sideways as Melissa screamed, colliding into me with raw panic, and as I stumbled, I felt the air grow heavy, pressing against my lungs, choking our reality into darkness. The screams echoed around us, mingled with laughter that belonged to the shadows, and in that fleeting moment, I understood that love had its price, and on this Valentine's Day, that debt would be paid either by our souls or the flame of a flickering heart. The early autumn sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm but fleeting glow on the forest floor, and as I ventured deeper into the woods, I felt a strange chill curling at the edges of my spine that I couldn't quite place, a sensation that hinted at something lurking just beyond my perception, something that whispered from the shadows. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. After all, I came here to find solace away from my chaotic life, A weekend escape to clear my mind and immerse myself in nature. The trail was well marked, a comforting assurance that I wouldn't get lost, yet as the path twisted and turned, I lost track of time and found that the vibrant hues of the trees had mellowed into a palette of gray-green as dusk began to creep in like an unwanted guest. Fear, I've always heard, is meant to be faced, not ignored, but I felt an involuntary tug at my instincts, that nagging voice warning me to turn back, to leave this forest behind. Fighting the urge, I took another step forward, convincing myself it was simply the eerie quiet of the wild that unsettled me. The woods were alive, of course, but their creatures had fallen silent, and in their absence, it felt as if the forest was waiting, watching, and I knew I should have paid attention when the first heavy silence descended like a shroud. As I continued along the winding trail, a rustling sound echoed from the underbrush, the kind that could easily be dismissed as a rabbit or an owl, yet the moment I turned, the tension gripped me tight. There was nothing there. The noise lingered in my ears, a reminder that something was off, yet I pressed on, drawn deeper into the trees, propelled by the need to prove my fear wrong. The sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening like dark fingers reaching for me, and I finally admitted the prickling at the back of my neck was too persistent to be ignored. It wasn't just the forest that felt wrong, it was me, an intruder among the ancient giants who stood silent and seemingly sentient around me. An unsettling instinct told me I belonged in the mundane world where time was linear, but here, a sense of timelessness made the ground feel unstable beneath my feet. That was when a bone-deep crack echoed through the thicket, like the breaking of an old tree, yet no tree fell. It was a sound born of tension and unease. My heart raced in a wild frenzy, beating against my ribcage like a caged animal, demanding an escape. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the source of that noise. But all I found was the twisted maze of trunks and branches closing in, an inescapable embrace that rooted me in place. I told myself to shake it off. The woods were known for their haunting qualities, but something primal was at play, an instinct older than civilization itself that told me to run, just run. I turned to follow the path back, but a sudden realization made my blood run cold. I couldn't retrace my steps. The world around me felt foreign, the trees unfamiliar and distorted in the failing light. And as panic washed over me, I understood in an instant that time had slurred itself. The day was slinking into night, and the quiet was no longer comforting but oppressive. That was when the whispering began, a sound almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves yet laced with urgency. It was a chorus of words, echoing through my mind as if the trees themselves were trying to tell me something, but all I felt was dread. I pressed on, heart racing, desperate to escape this palpable sense of wrongness that gripped the air. I stumbled into a clearing that felt suffocatingly vast, surrounded by looming silhouettes that stood eerily still, and suddenly, fear surged to a new level of clarity when my vision caught a glimpse of movement. It was soft and elusive, darting between the trees, something human-like but not, something distorted by shadows as if reality itself warped around it. My breath caught in my throat, every instinct screamed to run, yet I stood frozen, an observer in this midnight tableau, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I understood now why that rustle had chilled my blood. I was not alone, but I had once attempted to approach that knowledge with a dismissive attitude, only to be met with a reality I wasn't prepared to face. I turned to escape, but the darkness swallowed the path, twisting it into a labyrinth that began to feel alive, and with every step, I heard the whispers growing louder, insistent, no longer just murmurs but an overwhelming cacophony of voices, but I couldn't grasp the meaning of a single word. They sounded like they were resonating from all directions, and another distant crack echoed through the air, a warning, a call to someone, or something, concealed just behind the veil of the thicket, drawing near. I ran, then, my legs moving on instinct, guided by fear alone, branches clawing at me like skeletal hands ensnaring a runaway prisoner. The whispers intensified into a frenzied chant, raising hairs on my neck and spurring me forward into a pitch-black embrace where every tree formed a deceptive prison. Their trunks swelled, becoming thick, gnarled thing, no longer mere wood but vessels of something ancient. If fear had a sound, this was it, a bitter symphony playing in tune with my hammering heart. I tried to push through, past shadows and silhouettes that were no longer human or beckoning, but something primal and dark, reveling in the chaos of my flight. The fear roared like a wildfire within me, igniting every sense that screamed to me, turn back, turn back. Yet there was nowhere to escape to. I was caught in the wood's thrall, a performer in an unwitting act of horror. Then suddenly, I escaped the thick cluster of trees and tumbled onto the forest's edge. With a gasp, I fell onto the grass, lit by the moon's eerie light. I found myself face to face with an expanse of still water, the surface reflecting a cold, silver sheen, and, in the silence that followed my break, I heard it, the whispers fading into quietude as I clutched the mud, staring into the reflection. Something stirred beneath the surface, a shadow not cast by the moon but drawn from the depths, a dark coiling entity that hungered. I finally understood why I had felt that fear creeping ever closer. I was not meant to run, nor was I ever meant to hear those whispers. They had been warning me all along, but I, in my arrogance, had failed to listen. With a jolt, the water erupted, and I launched backward, scrambling on wet grass, staring wide-eyed into the void of the night as the forest resettled itself to silence. No one had come to find me. Those whispers might have led to my doom, but they had also offered a truth I had overlooked in ignorance. That evening, as I lay there under the watching moon, I realized that nature holds its secrets close, and it speaks in murmurs that draw on our very spirit. To listen is to awaken, and in that revelation, I finally understood the most chilling thing of all: fear, in the wild, is not just a warning. It is a language, one that would drown you if you dared disregard it, pulling you into realms where the light of understanding fades, leaving only shadows whispering eternity's name. Last winter was one I won't soon forget, and it all began on a frigid evening when the snow descended upon our small town like a shroud, blanketing everything in white and silencing our world with its icy grip. I was huddled inside my house, the wind howling mournfully outside, when I first heard the frantic scratching at my door. Initially, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, a figment conjured by the howling winds, but the scratching grew frantic, more desperate. When I finally opened the door, I was met with an unbelievable sight: a flock of animals, wild and panicked, huddled closely against my porch. A deer, its eyes wide with fear, stood next to a group of rabbits, their tiny hearts racing in unison. A few stray dogs barked nervously beside the feral cats, all darting around, desperately seeking warmth and refuge from the relentless storm. I didn't hesitate. I ushered them inside, my heart pounding not just from the cold air, but from the sense of urgency in their eyes, and after I locked the door, I realized none of them seemed inclined to leave, pressing their bodies against the walls, as if the shadows themselves harbored a threat that even I couldn't see. As the hours turned into a long, cold night, my home felt like an overstuffed menagerie, the sounds of whimpers and the shuffling of paws largely drowned by the furious winds outside. I sat curled up in my favorite chair with a blanket over my legs, wrapped in a cocoon of warmth as I watched them, all these trembling creatures huddle together in my living room. Yet, amidst their display of warmth-seeking behavior, I couldn't shake the feeling that their fear ran deeper than just the blizzard outside. It was only later that night when I noticed the odd behavior, how the deer relentlessly gazed at the windows, its nostrils flaring as it inhaled the air as if something foul lurked beyond those opaque panes. The others were also on edge, skittish and alert, casting wary glances toward the door, and with every crashing sound, the gusts battering against the walls, the creaking of the old house itself, it felt as if the house was holding its breath. At some point, I heard a low growl emanating from one of the stray dogs, its fur standing on end as it stared menacingly at the darkest corner of the room, triggering alarm bells in my mind. I cautiously followed its line of sight, peering into the inky shadows, but saw nothing at all. As hours passed and the storm escalated, I began hearing muffled noises, guttural and morose, carried in from the outside, raising the hairs on my neck. I couldn't see what was causing it, but I quickly grabbed my phone, desperately tapping out a message to my neighbor, who lived several acres away. The signal flickered, and my message staggered into oblivion without a single response, making me feel even more isolated. Just then, a deep, resonant howl filled the air outside, chilling me to my bones. The animals froze, terror flooding their eyes as they all turned towards the windows, their bodies rigid and waiting, and in that moment, I realized that whatever hunted them wasn't just hungry, it was malicious. It was at that precise moment when the deer let out a startled bleat, a cacophony of terrified animal sounds echoing in the room as the power suddenly went out, plunging us into a claustrophobic darkness. Only the eerie luminescence of the swirling snow outside illuminated our confined space. The animals darted toward the corners, seeking any refuge they could find while I clutched my flashlight, its beam dancing frantically across the walls as I struggled to steady my breath. In the unsettling stillness that followed, new sounds creaked at the edges, a clawed scratch against the door, followed by a vibration, A heavy weight pressing against the entryway, and it felt as if whatever was outside knew we were inside, that something was waiting for an invitation to breach the barrier between what was safe and what was not. My heart raced, and a flood of adrenaline surged through me as I edged toward the door. I couldn't stay there, cowering in the dark, waiting for whatever it was to break through. Just then, I heard a low whisper, a sound so foreign it sent ice through my veins. "Help. Us," it seemed to echo from outside, tantalizingly close, yet inhuman. My pulse quickened, the blood thundered in my ears as the stray dogs began barking wildly, their eyes wild. Was it wrathful, or were they simply panicking? I felt the floor tremble beneath my feet, a buckling that hinted at a presence beyond the splintering wood of my home. Then, without warning, the door shuddered violently as if something unseen was clawing at it, pushed by the force of malice that had drawn the posses of frightened animals to my doorstep. My breath quickened, and I realized I couldn't hold on to the hope of safety any longer. I needed to get out. Frantically rummaging through my pockets, I anointed my fingertips with the cold metal of my keys. The house creaked ominously, shadows unfurling against the walls as I mustered the courage to make a run for it. The wind screeched as I unlocked and flung the door open, snow swirling violently around me as I lunged into the storm, only to be faced with a sight that made my heart falter. There, in the middle of a blizzard that clouded everything in white, stood a towering figure, cloaked in shadows, its face concealed beneath a hood that brushed against the falling snowflakes. The animals had been right. They hadn't just sought refuge from the cold but from whatever malevolent entity this was, no longer just a perception, but an embodied darkness waiting for its chance to seize me. In my hurried retreat, I stumbled back, feeling the snow swallow my feet as panic set in, the bitter cold and howling wind now an afterthought compared to the terror of what lurked in the blizzard. And as I turned to run back towards the supposed safety of my home, I saw the tortured faces of the animals, still inside, their eyes pleading as the shadow pushed slowly forward, and I realized that staying was death, but leaving meant abandoning those who had sought refuge inside. My heart sank as I understood this was no ordinary blizzard, it was a full-scale siege of something ancient and vile, stirring the earth, awakening the echoes of a hunger that wouldn't be satisfied until all warmth was snuffed out, and it was then that I knew, I faced a choice that transcended simple survival, and perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't just the blizzard they were afraid of, but the very embodiment of despair wrought from the darkness rising in the storm and the sinister whispers that promised release from deep within the endless cold. I've always been a sucker for self-improvement nonsense, so when I stumbled upon an ad for an online psychology test claiming it could reveal my deepest fears and desires in just 30 questions, I was intrigued. After scrolling through countless testimonials, people swearing it changed their lives, I figured it couldn't hurt to take a crack at it. After all, the promise of uncovering hidden truths about myself felt enticing. I set aside a quiet evening, curled up in my dimly lit living room with a cup of tea, and began the test, the soft glow of the screen washing over me like a drug-induced haze, each question more probing than the last, challenging my perceptions and beliefs. The first few questions were basic: what do you value most in life? Followed by easier assessments of my past traumas and childhood memories, but soon it spiraled into a deeper territory, as if the test were peeling away layers of my persona, uncovering the raw essence of who I was. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I reluctantly answered questions about my hidden thoughts. Some were so unsettling I almost closed the window, yet I pressed on, drawn to this dark unveiling like a moth to a flame. By the time I hit the last question, I was anxious yet oddly exhilarated, convinced I was about to find some arcane truth that would explain the restless nights and deep-seated sadness that plagued me. The results came in a couple of minutes, the screen flashing a simplistic graph and a series of text boxes filled with insights that felt ominously accurate. The first line read, "You exhibit signs of extreme nostalgia for trauma," and my heart sank. It was a truth I had only whispered to myself in the dead of night, something I buried beneath layers of denial. The results unraveled like a tightly coiled spring, with each revelation striking chords within me that resonated with eerie clarity. It described my fears that no one else understood, like how I always felt a shadow lurking behind me during the day, an entity I had to glance back at when I walked alone. It spoke of my compulsive need for connection, revealing my friendships were fragile constructs built on transient conversations, that I feared being abandoned by the people around me but never had the guts to hold them closer, not truly, and that stung deeper than I thought possible. I wasn't just flaky, I was terrified. The worst came when it described a particular fear it labeled existential void, telling me that I often fantasized about my own death, how comforting it felt to escape the spinning chaos of my responsibilities, and I felt sick to my stomach, wanting to shred the computer screen to pieces. It also hit on my most toxic qualities, my penchant for pushing people away just to chase that familiar pain I'd felt as a child, when love was a luxury I could never afford. I was dumbstruck, staring at the results as if they had come from some oracle, my hands cold and trembling. Each word seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were breathing into my soul, distilling every dark corner I'd ever tried to sweep away. That night, the words echoed in my mind relentlessly, drowning out all rationality, and I struggled to sleep as the shadows crept closer, whispering secrets that only I was meant to know, until I drifted off in a state of confusion and dread. Days passed, and I tried to shake it off, but the revelations haunted me like a ghost in my peripheral vision. I became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding my friends, anxious that they might sense my spiraling despair. Every encounter felt like an exposed nerve, and I found myself avoiding mirrors, convinced they would show me the monster I truly was, the self I'd been blind to my entire life. I began experiencing vivid nightmares, each more horrifying than the last, where I would wake up gasping, my heart racing, with a shadowy figure echoing my own fears, an endless cycle of dread that gripped me tighter with every passing night. One evening, while sipping on cold coffee and wrapped in a blanket of paranoia, I noticed an email in my inbox. The subject line read, "Your results are complete." My heart pounded. I had already received the results once, hadn't I? Why was I getting another email? Against my better judgment, I clicked it open, and the message chilled me. It suggested I take a follow-up test, a supplementary analysis of my personality, and it claimed to be even more revealing. Part of me was horrified, but I couldn't resist. Curiosity drove me forward like a moth drawn to a flame, eager yet terrified of the potential truths waiting at the other end. I was a fool. I should have heeded the warning bells inside my head, but I couldn't turn away. I clicked through and entered my information yet again, the familiar dread rising as I confronted new questions, each dripping with undertones of despair. The intensity escalated rapidly, until the final questions began to dive headfirst into my darkest secrets. It felt as if I were sitting on the therapist's couch, exposed and raw. I was horrified to see how adept the test was at pulling my trauma to the surface, efficiently digging into feelings long buried, bringing them up like unsightly weeds choking the life out of my garden. When the results finally returned, a dread washed over me, seeping into my bones, the screen flashing another set of insights, but this time the language was sharper, more accusatory. "You have a detrimental obsession with self-pity," it read, and its implications wrung my gut like a fraying rope. "Your compulsions have created a feedback loop you cannot escape. The only way out is acceptance." I sat there, stunned, the truth of it crashing down like waves against rocky cliffs. No matter how much I tried to justify my feelings, it was evident I had become my own tormentor, a warden trapped inside my own prison of thoughts. It concluded with an ultimatum that sent me spiraling deeper into a well of despair. "There is a price for knowledge," it cautioned ominously, "and the more you learn about yourself, the harder it will become to silence the voices within." The notion that my own psyche could condemn me worsened my already spiraling thoughts, and as the sun vanished behind the horizon that evening, I could no longer distinguish reality from the phantoms of my mind. The shadows grew and conspired against my sanity, and for the first time, I felt those whispers evolve into something sinister, those fleeting images of the shadow, that entity from my dreams, manifesting into a presence that felt all too real. I realized I had unwittingly invited something into my life, a grotesque reflection of everything I feared, and I swore it wasn't just a figment of my nightmares anymore. Now, I can feel it watching me even in my waking hours, clawing at the fraying edges of my sanity, whispering the truths I never wanted to confront. I often wake up at the break of dawn, wide-eyed and breathless, only to find my heart pounding, terrified that I've awakened something dark and profound, a tangible horror lurking at the periphery of my consciousness. To this day, I regret taking that test. I wish I could unearth the buried trauma instead of stoking the flames of something far more sinister. If you ever come across a psychology test that promises to tell you about yourself, heed this warning: the truth comes with a cost, and sometimes, it's better to keep certain doors locked. I stumbled across the ad while scrolling through a local classified site. It read, "Husband wanted. Must be willing to relocate for an exciting new life." Intrigued, I clicked the ad, and after several paragraphs detailing a passion for adventure and a life of unique experiences, I felt a thrill of opportunity pulse through me, until I saw a photo of the woman who posted it. She was beautiful, her long red hair framing a face that seemed both inviting and unsettling, as if she harbored a secret behind her soft brown eyes. Curiosity piqued, I shot her a message, never imagining my life would spiral into a vortex of horror from that moment on. Within an hour, I received a reply that sent chills down my spine. Perfect. Meet me at the old barn on the outskirts of town at midnight tonight. Against better judgment, I found myself drawn to the mystery and willingly agreed. As I drove there, my mind raced with thoughts of what this enigmatic woman sought in a partner. Upon arrival, the barn loomed before me, an ancient structure cradled by the darkness, creaking under its own weight as the wind whistled through the gaps in its wooden slats. Stepping inside, I was engulfed in shadows, and the stale air tasted metallic, the scent of rust and abandonment swirling around me. You came a voice from behind a stack of hay bales, smooth and lyrical. I turned and saw her, the woman from the ad, now illuminated by a flickering lantern. I see something in you, she said, her smile playful yet predatory. They all test my patience, but you? I think you're different. My heartbeat quickened as I asked her what she meant, but her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. There are things I need to tell you. Things you'll understand when you see. Hesitantly agreeing to follow her deeper into the barn, I could feel a tension settling like smoke around us, and my gut churned with unease. She led me to a trapdoor hidden beneath the hay, and I hesitated, the rational part of me screaming to run, but curiosity chained my feet in place. She descended first, and I soon followed, finding myself in a dimly lit cellar that reeked of decay. It was a world beneath the world, where whispers of the past clung to the damp walls, they begged to be silenced. Welcome to my world, she whispered, her voice dripping with anticipation, as she gestured to an altar in the center of the room, littered with strange artifacts, jars of dark liquids, crooked bones, and tattered photographs of men who looked eerily similar to me. A shiver ran up my spine as I realized the faces in the images were twisted in terror, their eyes told a story of despair and hopelessness. They didn't understand what I needed, she said gently, reaching out to graze my cheek with icy fingers. But you're going to be different. You're going to understand what it means to belong to someone like me. Panic flared as I tried to back away, but the realization coursed through me. I was trapped in this woman's macabre game. Just then, the atmosphere thickened, vibrating with an energy that felt both electric and deadly. I'm so glad you found my ad, she said, her tone now eerily soothing. You'll make a fine addition to my collection. My throat tightened, and an overwhelming sense of dread tightened around my heart like a vice. What collection? I stammered, the words barely escaping my lips. My husband's, of course, she mused, her eyes glimmering with a wicked delight. Those who could not meet the challenge of my heart. I turned to run, but she was faster. In an instant, she had grabbed my wrist, and I could feel a coldness radiating from her that sank beneath my skin like poison. No one ever escapes, she whispered with such finality that it pierced the very marrow of my bones. In that moment, I realized this was not merely a recruitment, it was a slaughter, designed with meticulous precision. The altar glowed ominously as she proceeded to drag me closer, chanting incoherently, her voice intermingling with the weak, distant wails of those who had come before me. Despair clung to the shadows, wrapping around my sanity, and the faces of the men in the photographs materialized in the dim light, empty shells of once vibrant individuals trapped in her web of misery. I fought back, every ounce of primal instinct surging forth, but despite my resistance, I was no match for her unnatural strength. She pressed me against the altar, and panic surged through my body as I recognized the strange artifacts were less decorative and more ceremonial, each piece a dark reminder of the twisted fate suffered by those who had come before. You wanted to belong, she crooned, her breath chilling my skin, and now you shall. Just as the cold realization gripped my heart, the ground trembled beneath us, and a loud cracking noise echoed throughout the cellar. The walls shuddered like the breath of a dying beast. In a flash of chaos and terror, the ground opened beneath us, swallowing the altar whole, darkness licking at us like tongues of fire. I seized the moment to lash out, twisting away from her cold grasp, propelling myself toward the stairway. With every ounce of willpower, I scrambled back up the trapdoor, bursting into the night, the moon above a mocking witness to my flight. As I ran, unsteady and desperate, I could hear her laughter echoing in the wind, sweet and cruel, fading into the night, a promise that she was far from done. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of those predatory eyes watching me, her presence lingering long after I escape the grips of dread, and though I try to forget, the classified ad still haunts me, even as I still receive replies to my inbox with a slightly different message: "Come back, my love." Each new notification makes my skin crawl, and deep down, I know that no matter where I go, I'll forever belong to the darkness beneath that barn, with the cruel laughter of a woman who wanted a husband and a collection beyond imagination. I live in a gated community that prides itself on its tranquil atmosphere, picturesque yards, and considerate neighbors, but there's a rule etched into the lease that all residents must abide by: no laughing after dark. At first, it seemed ridiculous, a relic of a bygone era, a quirk meant to foster an air of solemnity. I shrugged it off, dismissing the warning as a device to maintain decorum, but that changed the night I moved in. After long days of unpacking, I found myself lounging on my porch, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the manicured hedges. As night descended, a blanket of silence wrapped around the community, the kind that felt heavy and unnatural. I spotted a neighbor, a middle-aged man with a stiff posture, peering from behind his curtains, the two bright lights streaming from his living room oddly unsettling. It was just past 8 when a raucous laugh broke the stillness, puncturing the quiet like glass shattering in a museum, and I froze, an inexplicable dread pooling in my stomach. It came from the direction of the Joneses' house, their children, I assumed, enjoying a family evening before bedtime. But before I could even chuckle at the innocence of it, the laughter abruptly ceased, replaced by a suffocating stillness that clawed at my throat. I glanced down the street, spotting all the house lights flickering out, like eerie fireflies retreating before an unseen danger. Chills skated down my spine, my instincts screamed at me that something was horribly wrong. Unable to shake off the feeling, I went inside, bolting the door. I tossed and turned that night, visions of wide-eyed children fading into the night, their carefree laughter morphing into whispered warnings that crawled under my skin. By morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The neighbors moved about their routines as if nothing had happened, but I could see the flicker of their eyes darting to each other, their cool exchanges lined with tension. Driven by a growing obsession to uncover the truth, I returned to the Joneses' house, but only to find dark windows. The door answered my knock with an echoing silence, and a gnawing sense of dread crept back in. I began asking other neighbors, but each inquiry was met with tight-lipped expressions, eyes flickering with fear as they subtly glanced towards Jones's house. "It's just always been that way," one whispered, clutching a steaming mug of coffee, as if shielding it from something unseeable. Their fear only deepened my curiosity, pushing me deeper into my investigation. That night, under the pale moonlight, I hid behind the bushes of the Joneses' house, patience potent in the cool air, and at precisely 8 o'clock, the laughter erupted again, a bubbling chorus interrupted by a low, resonating growl that sank into the walls like ink on paper. But this time, it was different. I could hear movements, shuffling feet, and the unmistakable clatter of furniture being knocked aside. Convinced I was about to witness something momentous, I crept forward, the laughter twisting airy in the night, morphing into something grotesque, something that sent shivers down my spine. Just when I thought they were simply jesting, the wild laughter was swallowed up into a sharp gasp, followed by an unholy silence that smothered the night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, my heart thundering in my ears as I stepped back, wanting nothing more than to flee. That's when the shadows moved. A massive figure loomed around the corner of the building, and the sharp screams erupted one last time, a symphony of terror as a child was yanked into the darkness. Panic surged, adrenaline speckled my vision as I sprinted towards the gate, desperate to escape the confines of this hellish place, but the cool air grew prickly as a chilling realization pierced my mind: the community wasn't just watching out for laughter, it was actively silencing it. Had those ill-fated kids gotten too loud? Was there a monster lurking in the shadows that required the neighborhood to remain solemn? The truth flooded in, choking my breath as the gate loomed closer and closer, but the sound of laughter had returned, playful and innocent, now echoing through the air as I turned back for one last glance. The sight I beheld forever searing into my mind. The neighbors were gathered, those familiar faces now twisted with a rapturous glee, their eyes alight with an ecstatic madness as they danced under the pale moon, the children nowhere to be found. I stumbled back, the weight of fear rooting me to the spot until the shadows shifted again, warping into grotesque shapes. Glancing over my shoulder, the taunting giggle resonated louder as I felt a tugging at my heart, a primal urge to laugh, to join in their twisted revelry, a voice whispering that perhaps it was better to laugh than to live in fear. But as I stood there, trapped in that nightmarish revelation, I turned and bolted, the laughter echoing behind me, a cacophony of joy with an undercurrent of hunger, promising that anyone foolish enough to break the one rule of our gated community would know its true price before morning dawned, a price I vowed I would never pay. When I was 8, my older brother, Alex, passed away in a car accident. My world shattered in an instant. He was my protector, my confidant, my best friend, and I didn't know how to live in a world without him, until the night I first heard his voice again, beckoning from the shadows of my grief. It began as a whisper in the stillness after I had cried myself to sleep, an echo so familiar it pierced the fog of my sorrow. "It's okay, Sam, I'm still here." I jolted awake, heart racing, convinced I was dreaming until his soft laughter filled the room, an ethereal melody that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. Alex had a way of making everything feel safe, and I wanted desperately to believe it was him, to reach out and embrace the intangible. From that night on, our conversations surged from the depths of my longing. I would sit atop my bed, the curtain billowing gently as I kept vigil for his return, and he came, with tales that stirred my imagination and filled the void he left behind, telling me about the world beyond death in vibrant colors that danced in my mind, how time slipped through the fingers of the departed like sand, how he met people who had once walked the earth, now shadows of their former selves living in an endless twilight. He shared secrets about the afterlife. He said it was a place of peace where pain couldn't reach us and laughter echoed through the corridors of eternity, filling my heart with a bittersweet melody that belied my waking sorrow. Alex became my guide, the comforting voice that reminded me I was never truly alone. I would ask him questions, curious little probes into the abyss, hoping for hints about his death, but all I got was vague reassurance, almost as if he was protecting me from the darker truth that lingered just beyond the veil. With every secret he shared, I felt bolder, more alive, as if I too could transcend the limitations of my fragile existence. He talked about memories, names etched into the fabric of the universe, and the hidden strength he found in letting go. But as months turned into a year, I started to notice something unsettling. Each visit from Alex seemed heavier, as if the toll of his existence on the other side was more burdensome than I'd realized. The once vibrant details in his stories began to fade, as if they were being lost to time itself, smudging the colors of our shared dreamscape. His laughter became strained, and instead of discussing the wonders beyond death, he would speak in fractured fragments, hints of things left unsaid, his tone dropping into darker territory. He'd ominously mention a veil that some should not cross, a murky reflection of the life we couldn't touch, and as the chills settled in my bones, I clutched my bedspread, desperate to keep the fading warmth of our connection alive. One night, I dared to ask about the accident, my heart pounding as the air thickened with an unsettling silence. He responded with a warning that sent chills shooting up my spine, urging me to never seek the truth too deeply, as if he knew there were edges to reality we weren't meant to tamper with. I didn't listen. Instead, I began digging through family memories, pulling at threads of the past, growing obsessed with unraveling the mystery surrounding Alex's death. I spoke to my parents, but they clammed up whenever the topic arose, and I noticed glimpses of fear flash across their faces, that only fueled my determination until one haunted afternoon, I stumbled upon a faded newspaper article buried in a box that detailed the crash, a blur of broken glass and twisted metal, but more importantly, I noticed a name that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Panic gripped my heart, and for the first time, I felt an upper world collapse around me as shadows lengthened in my room. I rushed back to my sanctuary, desperate for guidance. When I called out to him, the silence stretched and curled like smoke, and dread settled in the bones of my being. "Alex?" I whispered, but the darkness answered with an unsettling void, the comfort of his presence replaced by a haunting chill that seeped into my soul, and his absence echoed louder than any words. The following nights were agonizing, sleep evaded me, and when I finally drifted off, I was met with nightmares that turned my dreams into monstrous reflections of my fears, blending the past and the present into nightmarish parodies of reality. I could feel Alex drawing closer, but there was a disquieting presence that flitted just beyond, a gnawing sensation of being watched, and the whispers turned into cries for help, a cacophony of terrified souls crying out from shadows, begging to be freed. I awoke every morning overwhelmed by a new sense of dread, an inexplicable sense that I had awakened something I was never meant to find. I felt Alex slipping away, losing his warmth, and in its place, something cold and malevolent was coiling around my heart. Desperate, I confronted the mirrors of my life, searching for the connection that had once lit up my darkness, until one fateful night, tearing through the paper-thin veil between dreams and reality, I finally saw him, the real Alex, not the brother I had known and loved, but a kinder echo being twisted by something much darker. "What did you do?" I pleaded, my voice trembling, terror clawing at my throat as I caught a glimpse of the name I had found, an inexplicable bond shadowing our souls, and in those eyes, I saw the truth behind the calm facade he had built. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered, voice distorted, tainted with a pain that vibrated through my core. The warm laughter of my memories turned hollow and sinister, and I knew then I had crossed too far. I had taken a step into the abyss without knowing what lay beneath. As he faded back into the darkness, the heaviness of his absence pressed down on me, and I understood the truth he had tried to protect me from. Sometimes, the living shouldn't seek out the lost, and some doors should never be opened. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, unmoored from any thread of companionship, a ceaseless tide that dragged me deeper and deeper until I awoke one final time, gasping, a fine sheen of sweat coating my skin, grabbing the edges of reality, knowing I had lost Alex forever. I stared into the mirror, desperate for a shred of truth, only to find my own reflection staring back at me, eyes wide with the understanding that some connections are meant to be severed, even if it means learning to live with the pain. And as the shadows swept through the room, the darkness grinned back, promising that it would be waiting, always waiting, for another chance to snatch a glimpse of the truth buried in forgotten memories. "My daughter is missing. I don't want you to find her." Maybe that sounds selfish, but let me explain. I still remember the day she vanished, how the sun shone down like it was mocking me and how I wiped my brow with shaking hands, praying it was just a cruel prank. When we realized she hadn't come home from school, panic crept in like a shadow, heavy and suffocating, but it wasn't until nightfall, when the last slivers of daylight bled into the horizon, that dread truly clawed at my insides. We searched the neighborhood, voices cracking as we called out her name, Ella. But all that returned was the laughter of distant children, a cruel reminder of all the joy she'd once brought into our lives. The police were called, they scoured the parks and the nearby woods, and the interviews began. Well-meaning neighbors shared their sympathies, but their eyes were heavy with suspicion, whispers twisting around my heart like an insistent vine, planting the seed of blame. I was the neglectful parent, the one who'd let her wander off too far, the one who had to bear the weight of the guilt lodged in their self-righteous gazes. It wasn't until they began to suspect something darker was at play that I really began to lose it. The pounding of my heart echoed in my ears as I paced, waiting, praying for news, but all I got was a series of unsettling storms. Dreams plagued by visions of her wandering through the darkened woods, clutching a rusty doll, eyes hollow, surrounded by those flickering shadows. And then, rumors spread like wildfire. There were whispers of strange sightings, a tall figure lurking near the woods with an elongated face, too pale for earthly skin. They said he takes children and leaves strange markings on the trees, symbols no one could decipher. I remember staring at the walls of our home, the family photos casting mocking smiles, as if to say this was my fault, that I should have held her closer, should have wrapped her in my arms and never let go. Days turned into a blur of false hope and despair. The media frenzy only amplified my spiraling dread as search parties more interested in headlines gathered around our house like vultures. But they weren't looking for her. No, they were looking for a story, a tragedy to dissect under bright lights. And I, a once devoted father, became a mere character in their 5-minute segments, a broken man with a shattered dream, only wanting to scream, "Ella isn't lost. She's gone." The more they probed, the more I felt their eyes, those reptilian glances assessing and dissecting, as if everything leading to this moment could find absolution in my confession. But the truth was layered, deeper than bone. Ella hadn't simply wandered off. No, she had gotten curious, poking around the edge of the woods one day after school, and I, lost in my phone, hadn't even noticed. When I finally looked up, she was gone, swallowed whole by the trees that seemed to come alive, their branches beckoning her like arachnids urging a flighted air approach. I found her shoe, one tiny, pink, scuffed. I collapsed against a tree, and in that moment, I realized I'd always known the woods held something dark, but dismissing it had once been easier. Those markings they spoke of, I had seen them long before Ella disappeared. Scrawled across the trees as if someone had traced them with blood. I had always thought they were part of some kid's weird game, a way to warn others away, but the warnings were for me, for parents like me who let their children wander alone. The rhythmic sound of my breathing became a mantra, a prayer as I pleaded with the universe for guidance. Days turned into weeks, the local news cycle shifted to the next missing person, and Ella became another statistic, but to me she was flesh and blood, laughter and dreams. As the search stretched on, I entered the woods in desperation. Whispers filled the air, tickling my ears with secrets I could only begin to fathom. I followed the faint sounds of giggling, the rustling of branches, and perhaps that's when I should have turned back. Maybe I could have saved myself the horrors that awaited me there. The deeper I went, the clearer the symbols became. They glowed in the shadowed corners of my mind, drawings of children with bright, smiling faces, surrounded by dark tendrils reaching for them, a suffocating embrace. And then I saw it, a clearing adorned with flowers, vibrant and otherworldly, glowing with an ethereal light that made my heart race. In the center sat a figure, tall and expansive, with skin stretched tight over angles that shouldn't belong. Its face shifted and warped, too many eyes darting around like trapped flies. In front of it, a circle of children swayed in an eerie dance, Ella among them with her smile, so innocent and pure, a vision that shattered my mind. They were entranced, laughing and spinning, completely oblivious to the terror surrounding them. I realized then, horrified, that they weren't lost, they belonged to this creature, bound by an ancient pledge woven into the very fabric of this place. I wanted to scream, to shake her from her stupor, but fear gripped me. The figure turned, eyes locking onto mine, and in that moment, I understood everything. It wasn't after all the parents searching for their children, it was the parents who had let them go, who hadn't paid attention to the warnings, the subtle shifts of the woods turning dark. I fled, tears streaming down my face, desperate to leave behind that grotesque tableau of twisted innocence. But as I burst into the light of day, a weight settled in my gut. I understood then that the shadowy figure had spoken, even without words. There would be no rescue party, no searchers would return with hope. I was meant to let her go. So, I sat in silence, the whispers of fear writhing around me, and did what any father would, waited for another storm, for the media to move on, and I let the forest keep her. I didn't want you to find her. I wanted peace to wash over me like a febrile dream. I wanted Ella to be happy, basking in the light of that false sun, forever dancing within the embrace of the creature in the woods. I never thought the request would shatter our marriage, but there we were, throbbing tension thickening the air as my husband, Daniel, leaned back against the couch, his eyes aglow with excitement. "It's just a birthday gift, babe," he urged, biting his lip in that way he always did when he was trying to sell me on a questionable idea. His birthday was approaching, and I had blinded myself to the fact that he had grown restless in our 6-year marriage. I found the concept of a threesome, something I had dismissed as a frivolous fantasy, spreading a sickening pit in the stomach, but it was hard to say no to the one man who had always treated me with love and respect, the one who had painted sunsets on my heart. Yet, the more I listened, his words dripped honey-sweet yet felt like poison. When I hesitatingly agreed, a rush of nausea welled up, and I was struck by the nagging dread that I was sacrificing not just my own comfort but potentially much more. Over the next few days, I scoured the internet for advice, and the thrill of it felt almost exhilarating until I read horror stories of lovers turned roommates, friendships shattered by the weight of unfulfilled expectations. My heart raced, realizing that our intimacy was threading dangerously close to something unrecognizable. I began to think of what might go wrong. What if I got jealous or the third person didn't have chemistry with him, or worse yet, what if he liked her more than he liked me? I proposed we set boundaries, even to chat with the other women beforehand, but Daniel was adamant, spontaneity was key, he insisted, and as foolish as it seemed, I could feel a chill creep like ivy into my mind, clawing at my insecurities, but I pushed them aside, surrendering to his wishes. We found an online ad, and when she responded, a thrill coursed through me as I read her message. Sarah, 27, adventurous, and curiously flirty. Daniel was infatuated with her instantly, reading her messages aloud like a child showcasing a shiny new toy. The day she agreed to come over, I could feel the tension coiling in the pit of my stomach like a rattlesnake about to strike. As the hour approached, I tried to talk myself into calmness, mentally pumping myself up for what was to come, but deep inside, something felt profoundly wrong. As if the universe was tipping heavy like it had taken a cruel turn, the air dense with unspoken foreboding. When Sarah arrived, she adorned a skin-tight red dress that hugged her curves with a sultry magnetism, her laughter infectious and velvety, and Daniel, his eyes gleaming with admiration, introduced her to our home like she was a long-lost goddess. They flirted effortlessly, and I was a ghost in my own home, awkwardly skirting the edge of their chemistry like a marionette with frayed strings, feeling increasingly isolated and invisible until I finally broke. Can we maybe talk about what boundaries we established before we... My voice trilled off, unrealizing that the energy around us was swirling, spiraling out of control into something wild and unearthing. Their eyes darted to mine, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of annoyance cross Daniel's face that felt like a cold dagger. Sarah too was lit with impatience, and they both dismissed me in a shared glance. As we finally crossed the threshold, my heart raced. I felt like a trembling leaf caught in a fierce gale. They were mouths hungry for each other, bodies entwining, and I was a mere spectator, feelings of loneliness washing over me like a torrential rainstorm, drowning my resolve. I could hardly breathe when he kissed her, the sensation scraping at my insides like claws meeting flesh, and I could feel him gradually withdrawing from me, as if every whispered promise he'd made was crumbling before my eyes in silence, and the desire that latterly filled the room morphed into dread. As things heated up, an idea, a surreal, terrifying thought wormed its way into my mind. What if I wasn't just losing my husband, but I was losing myself? Just as I was about to voice my concerns, the lights flickered ominously, plunging our living room into darkness for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, and instinct kicked in. What was that? I gasped, panic tightening my throat, but Daniel only chuckled, whispering that it was just the old wiring in the house. But the stillness that followed felt alive, encasing us in a strange tension that made me shiver in disbelief. The lights flickered back on, revealing Sarah's expression, a mix of exhilaration and something deeply unsettling. And then, as if the very atmosphere shifted, I noticed the change in Daniel's gaze. It wasn't just lust anymore, it was possessive, almost hungry, as if he was no longer my husband but a beast enthralled by a fresh kill. That flicker of humanity began to erode away, replaced by something darker, and in that moment, I realized this was no casual encounter, it was a reckoning. The room turned to chaos as they began to indulge in one another, and as if time had fractured, I felt rooted to the floor, every ounce of my emotional turmoil erupting into tangible fear. I felt the solid weight of panic clipping my senses. I was hyper-aware of every misstep, every glance, and then, as I gathered courage, I inched forward, calling out to Daniel amidst the dizzying whirl of desire that engulfed him. "This isn't what we wanted," I pleaded, my voice echoing through the thickened air. He paused suddenly, the heat of the moment waning, but his reply came twisted, caught between two worlds. "You're the one who wanted this, remember? You wanted to give me the best birthday ever." Those words crashed against me like heavy waves sinking my resolve, and in that moment, Sarah's gaze turned into an unreadable mask, and I knew deep down that darkness had seeped into our lives, consuming us with uncertainties we could never escape. Just as I felt a swift thread of panic compress my chest, something stirred inside me, a primal instinct demanding to be set free, the cries of my heart urging me to reclaim the control I had so willingly relinquished. But before I had time to enact my thoughts, Sarah reached for Daniel's hand, her smile dripping with a confidence that sent shards of ice dancing along my spine. In that same instant, the lights flickered once more, plunging us into a darkness so absolute I held my breath, and the shadows that morphed around us felt almost sentient, crawling into corners and caressing the edges of our souls. The silence broken only by hushed whispers carried something sinister. I realized she was no simple thrill seeker but something dark, enticing, like the very embodiment of temptation itself. The atmosphere grew heavy, almost suffocating, the shadows watching, waiting, as if the whole room held its breath, caught in a dance of primal urges and unchecked desires that poisoned the very fabric of our relationship. Suddenly, I felt it. She was drawing Daniel further under her spell, the room pulsing with a hunger that echoed my deepest fears. Was I losing him, losing myself to this whims of passion, this delusion? Yet, pain burst forth as vivid reminders clawed at my heart, forcing me to remember the promise, the love we had built in our once rosy world. My resolve hardened like iron, and as the shadows twisted, I stepped forward, breaking free of the mental shackles tying me to my insecurities. In that moment of uncertainty, clarity washed over me, and I felt a pulse of defiance surge within. "Daniel," I shouted, and the name echoed through the darkness, a plea for the man I had loved fiercely before all these entangled emotions took hold. But the flickering glow of the living room lights cast Daniel's distorted face, a mask of confusion mixed with desire, and something dark, a transformation which turned my heart into stone. Just then, the shadows leapt at me, becoming almost tangible, slipping between my fingers as I reached for him. I whimpered, feeling like a vessel captured by an unseen force, and the distance between us expanded. My heart raced as Sarah's husky laughter intertwined with Daniel's muddled words, wrapping around me like a snake, squeezing tighter until streams of icy water pooled in my eyes. I grasped at the flickering lights, hoping for clarity, a return to our love, and yet those shadows only coiled deeper around Daniel, tugging at his hungry gaze, and in that moment, I realized, this wasn't about the three of us, it was about me and the abyss I'd invited into our lives, blinding me to the darkness waiting at the edges. This was his birthday, but a rite of passage into unknown realms, something darker than I could ever have imagined, and as panic clawed at my insides, I felt a despair I had never known. This was my last call to salvage what spark we had left, and I stepped forward, a wave of courage surging through, trembling yet firm. I'm not backing down from this, Daniel, I'm still here. And I want the man I married. But as the seconds dragged, shadows danced around us, blocking my view, entering our skins, and my heart plummeted, exhausting like flames of uncertainty bludgeoning the resolve of love. In a cold realization, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for Daniel, I was fighting for the whisper of the woman I had once been, the wife who smiled in innocence, and the realization hit, our marriage was not swiftly disappearing into the night, it was on the precipice of something unspeakable, caught between lust and the wicked waltz of choices made. Desperate, I reached deep into the memory of our happiest moments, drawing upon the essence of our love, and as another flicker plunged us into momentary darkness, I whispered his name again, my voice breaking, we can overcome this. You can come back to me. But like a resonating echo, only silence answered, and suddenly, the light surged back to blinding brightness to reveal Sarah woven into his arms, entangled in a mess of comfort and illicit desire, their connection an unmistakable bond I was locked out from, trapped between passion and fear of abandonment. I staggered back, breath hitching in my throat, my heart splintering under the weight of abandon as the reality washed over me. Daniel was not just lost in lust, but willingly entwined in shadows beyond what we had ever shared, entrapped in a dark craving harboring the slightest of threads that shouted despair, and I realized, staring into an abyss of my own disillusion, that I had opened a door best left locked, a Pandora's box of perils, leaving potential devastation lurking on the threshold. Growing up, I always believed my Uncle Matt was one of the most eccentric figures in my life, the type of guy who could turn an ordinary family gathering into a wild adventure filled with stories of strange places and even stranger people, but the truth is, I've recently come to the horrific conclusion that he never existed at all. It started last summer when my parents finally decided to clean out the attic after years of neglect. I was tasked with sorting through the dusty old boxes, and as I pulled one down, I spotted faded photographs of holiday get-togethers, and right in the center of one, there he was, Uncle Matt, my charming, enigmatic uncle with a twinkle in his eye and an unmistakable presence, except that my parents didn't recognize him at all. I thought it was just a case of memory lapses, so I excitedly flipped through the album, showing them the pictures, recalling tales from my childhood, the summer campfire songs, the way he laughed uproariously at his own jokes, how he always seemed to have a secret stash of candy. But my parents exchanged confused glances, their brows furrowed with disbelief, as they informed me that they had no brother named Matt, and that, in fact, my father was an only child. My heart raced as I fought to convince them I was not imagining him. I recounted Christmases spent with Uncle Matt kneeling next to the tree, energetically handing out presents and cracking jokes that lit up the room until my mother finally sighed, "Honey, you must be mistaking him for someone else." As frustration bubbled within me, I swore I could hear Uncle Matt's laughter echoing in my memory, so vivid and alive, and determined to prove his reality, I scoured the rest of the attic, hoping to unearth something, an old toy, a letter, anything that could validate my memories. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the attic floor, and just as I was about to give up, I stumbled upon an old, rusty box tucked in the back corner, the kind that felt like it held secrets from another world. I carefully pried it open and found what appeared to be a collection of faded letters, yellowed with age and irregularly addressed. They were addressed to me, written in a lively scrawl that mirrored how I remembered Uncle Matt spoke. I could feel a chill crawling up my spine as I read through the letters, each more unnerving than the last, recounting personal details about my life that he had no right to know, childhood fears, crushes, even the terrible fall I took when I was 10 that had me in a cast for 6 weeks. He signed off each letter with a warm "Your loving Uncle Matt," as if assuring me he was genuinely invested in my life. Confused, I raced downstairs, clutching the letters, desperate to show my parents, convinced that this would finally validate my memories, but when I confronted them, their faces turned pale. They couldn't have seen those letters, they insisted. It wasn't possible. But I needed to speak to someone who could understand, so I called my grandmother, a sharp woman who had always looked at me with a knowing gaze that could cut through layers of confusion. I explained everything, breathless and frantic, and after a long pause, she told me to meet her at her house that evening, her voice trembling with a gravity I hadn't expected. I arrived with the letters in hand, practically spilling my heart out to her, pleading for some sort of clarification. The tension was palpable as she scrutinized the letters, her expression shifting from concern to fear. "Honey, you need to understand something," she said finally, her voice low. "There's a family legend about a curse that affects our kin. Whenever one of us gets too close to the truth, those figures who represent the shadows of our past are erased from existence, forgotten until they become nothing but whispers in the wind." I felt ice course through my veins at her words, and I was left staggered in the aftermath of revelations. She warned me to keep my distance from the box, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Uncle Matt was more than just a harmless memory. He was a part of me that my family had tried to suppress, buried deep in the attic of our minds. That night I lay awake, the weight of dread pressing down on me, and the deeper I dove into my memories, the more I recalled snippets of conversations with Uncle Matt, the peculiar way he'd warned me about the importance of remembering the forgotten, the stories he spun about being caught between realms, echoing and fading with the light of day. It was then that I realized I wasn't losing just a memory, I was losing a piece of my soul. Days passed, and with every sunrise, I noticed fleeting glimpses of Uncle Matt, a shadow out of the corner of my eye, laughter reverberating through the house when no one was home, whispers of a name that hung in the air like a forgotten melody. It was as though he desperately clung to me, fighting against the erasure fast approaching. I even took to the woods behind our house searching for signs of him, convinced he might appear in a form that I could touch, but it only led to darker fears. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the trees cast ominous silhouettes against the sky, I ventured deep into the woods, guided by the tug of my memories, until I stumbled upon a narrow path lined with strange symbols carved into the bark, symbols that eerily resembled the handwriting in those cursed letters. My heart raced, and the air thickened with an unnatural stillness as I felt an otherworldly presence looming over me, shadows creeping along the thicket, wrapping around me like a shroud. I thought I could hear Uncle Matt calling my name, and for a fleeting moment, I felt his warmth envelop me, but within seconds, that warmth turned icy, and I was flooded with dread. The world around me warped, twisting in a violent dance of memory and loss, and suddenly, I was face to face with a figure shrouded in darkness, a mirror of my Uncle Matt without the twinkle in his eye, the very essence of him twisted into something unrecognizable. "You shouldn't have searched for me," the figure whispered, his voice a chilling echo of what I once adored. "You weren't supposed to remember." In that horrifying moment, I understood. Uncle Matt was a guardian of truths forgotten, an entity crafted from my childhood joys and fears, a mere flicker on the fragile fabric of existence that my family desperately attempted to erase. And now, standing in the depths of the woods, I felt the breathtaking weight of their curse creeping in, a heart-wrenching realization that my quest to reclaim Uncle Matt had only served to unravel the memories tying me to him. I ran, evading the ominous laughter that seemed to chase me through the trees, my breath ragged from panic. I burst into the safety of my home, but the further I ran, the heavier the shadows grew, gnawing at my sanity, pulling me towards the truth that Uncle Matt was simply a collection of whimsical memories destined for oblivion. When I finally turned to confront my family again, they looked at me with hollow eyes, and it dawned on me that I could no longer see his image in their faces. Uncle Matt was gone forever, cast away by the burden of revelation. To this day, I wonder if I would have been better off letting those memories fade into obscurity, clinging to the ghost of a man who never truly existed, but maybe that's the cruel irony. He did exist, and in forgetting him, my family ensured that the darkness would consume those who sought to remember, leaving me haunted by the remnants of a man who loved me fiercely and yet was never meant to have existed at all. I'm a private investigator, but I never expected to be hired for something as bizarre as stalking a client. It all began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she walked into my office, a petite woman with bright red hair and eyes that sparkled like emeralds, dressed in a vintage dress that seemed out of place in our modern world. She introduced herself as Clara and, with a trembling voice, explained that she needed my expertise to follow her. My first instinct was to question the legality and morality of such a request, but as she laid out her story, I felt an inexplicable urge to help her. Clara claimed she had started receiving strange messages from an anonymous sender who seemed to know her every move, her deepest fears, and even the mundane details of her life, where she got her groceries, her favorite coffee shop, and when she took her dog for a walk. Each message was signed with just a sinister V. At first, I considered whether she was simply paranoid, but Clara's demeanor was sincere, and I could see the fear written all over her face, which looked paler than any ghost I'd ever seen. Intrigued and a bit concerned, I agreed to take the case, thinking it would be just another boring job with a twist of psychological thriller. I followed her for a week, keeping my distance, blending in with the surrounding crowds as she went about her life, stopping at boutiques, her daily yoga class, and the small park where she'd sit quietly, feeding the ducks. Then, I began to notice odd things, shadows lurking just out of sight, people I didn't recognize hanging around longer than necessary, and most disturbingly, the way Clara would stop mid-sentence when she felt she was being watched. Each day, I gathered more intel and continued to dig into her past. She seemed to be a typical woman, but there was something off, as if she were hiding part of herself. One evening, while tailing her to a bookstore, I decided to poke around to see if I could catch a glimpse of those shadowy figures she feared. With every passing minute, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt the prickling sensation of eyes on my back. Clara left the store carrying an old, worn book with no title on the spine, and, compelled by a strange curiosity, I followed her home, a modest little place on a quiet street. I parked at the end of the block and watched as she locked her door with shaky hands, her eyes darting around as if she could feel me watching, but I wasn't there to harm, only to protect her. That night, I decided to go back to the bookstore to learn more about that peculiar tome she purchased. When I stepped inside, the bell dinged ominously, and the scent of old paper wrapped around me like a heavy fog. I asked the clerk about the book, only to be met with a glassy-eyed stare and a muttered warning to leave well enough alone. Suspicious, I slipped behind the aisles and, after a few minutes of searching, found that same book hidden on a dusty shelf, slamming it down on the counter for purchase. As I hurried out, I couldn't help but notice the same figure from earlier, drenched in shadows, just watching me from outside. Heart racing, I rushed home to read the book, only to unveil pages filled with fragments of stories about people who had gone missing, impossible tales, retellings of lives snatched away, but they all shared one bizarre detail: each victim had received a correspondence, marked with a V. That night, I didn't sleep. I pored over the text until dawn, and it dawned on me, Clara was being hunted, and I was caught in the web. When I finally fell asleep, my phone startled me awake at 3 a.m. The message on the screen was plain: no contact, but a simple photograph of Clara at the park, smiling innocently, large eloquent letters beneath it reading, "Isn't she wonderful?" Panic surged through my veins. I leapt out of bed and sped to her place, every instinct screaming that time was running out. When I got there, I found the door ajar, a sickly sweet scent wafting through the space. I rushed in, my heart pounding, calling her name, but only silence echoed back. As I entered the living room, I saw the walls were tarnished with what looked like strange symbols, and the only light came from a flickering candle. Suddenly, I heard the familiar sound of her voice, a warped version of her laugh, coming from the upstairs, beckoning me with an allure I couldn't resist. I tiptoed up the creaky stairs, adrenaline fueling my steps as I stumbled upon a room shrouded in darkness. There, at the center, Clara appeared, not the woman I had been following but a twisted reflection of her, her eyes vacant and shining, entranced by something I couldn't see. At that moment, I realized I had become the prey, ensnared in a game greater than myself. From the shadows emerged that figure I thought I'd lost track of, but it was no stranger at all. "Clara," I gasped, an icy dread settling in. The shadowy figure wore her face, a mere mask to hide the depths of the dark energy pulsating behind it. They both laughed, an echoing chorus intertwining and drowning out my scream as they revealed the horrifying truth: I was the next piece in this elaborate ritual, designed to ensnare and feed the void, signed not just by me but a never-ending cycle of souls lost in the chase for something they never truly understood. And in that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that I was never going to escape. I had become part of the story written in that cursed book, the ink stained with desperation and dread, forever bound to the shadows that had whispered to Clara, and now to me. Every night at the roadside motel where I work, I hear the old tales of skinwalkers, but I never thought I'd have to face them myself, until last week, when the first mysterious guests checked in. It was just past midnight when a beat-up pickup pulled into the lot, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Two men stepped out, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods, and they moved with a strange, jerky pace that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I handed them the key to room 4 and noticed something unsettling about their eyes, too wide, too bright, almost reflective under the buzzing neon lights. After they disappeared into the room, I figured I was just being paranoid, but the feeling in my gut only tightened when I overheard them through the thin walls, speaking in a guttural language I couldn't decipher. Days passed, and while I thought about reporting them, something kept me from doing it. Maybe it was the isolation of the motel in the woods and the chill of the October air that crawled under my skin, but I felt trapped in a web of unease. They stayed for a few days, accompanied by an ever-present smell of damp earth and something rotten, like death itself had decided to take up precedence. Every night, I heard them, chanting softly, sometimes howling like wounded animals, and the sound seeped into my dreams, turning to visions of dark figures flickering at the edges of my consciousness. Then came the guests, each leaving in terror after only a few hours, claiming they had seen things lurking in the woods, shapes that didn't belong. There were whispers of a figure darting past windows, a shadow that melted away before it could be seen clearly, and every incident felt eerily connected to those two men. I decided to keep watch, hoping to unveil whatever horror was stalking the grounds. On the 4th night, the wind howled like a wounded beast, casting a strange melody through the trees, and for hours, I sat in the dim lobby, my heart thudding in my ears. Around 2 a.m., I left my post and crept outside, flashlight trembling in my grip as I approached room 4. The doorway was ajar. I needed to know what these men were up to. Peering inside, I was met with darkness, that smell now overpowering, a mixture of musk and rot. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, making me jump, and I heard a voice from inside, a low, guttural whisper that chilled my bones. It was one of them, warped and twisted as if something inhuman was trying to speak through their skin. "Help us," it rasped, the plea shredding the air. In a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, I asked what they needed help with, but my words were lost to the rustle of leaves and the unsettling sounds of night. I spun around, feeling as if eyes were watching me, and that's when I saw it, a figure lurking by the trees, its posture impossibly bent as it watched me with a grin too large for its face. I stumbled back, the flashlight beam flickering wildly as I caught sight of other shapes, moving in the darkness, mimicking the movements of the men, yet sharper, more grotesque. They were changing, morphing, and I realized the truth. The legends were alive, and I had opened a door I couldn't close. A wave of desperation surged through me. I turned and fled back to the safety of my car, praying they hadn't noticed my frightful glimpse into their depravity. I drove down the gravel road, but the panic didn't recede. The screams of the last guests echoed in my head, and I could feel those eyes still watching. I called in sick the next day, hoping to escape this growing horror, but when I called my boss to check in, he told me that the motel was full, completely booked. I could already hear the howling start again, and I knew deep down that those men hadn't just been staying there, they had drawn something out of the woods, awakening ancient terrors that lingered in the night. I returned the next evening, compelled to confront whatever curse had nestled itself among the walls of my workplace, but as I stepped inside, it felt as if the shadows themselves were laughing. Everything seemed normal at first. The desk was quiet, but every single room key was turned upside down, and the air was thick with something electric, a promise of dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, and as I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, the soft scratching sound came from the back door. Night after night, I had bathed in the glow of the motel neon. I didn't realize I was inviting a darkness I couldn't comprehend. The scratching turned to pounding, a relentless demand to be let into the light. In a panic, I rushed toward the door, determined to see who, or what, was making such a racket. With my heart racing and breath coming in short gasps, I swung the door open, expecting the two men, but found only the moonlight illuminating an empty courtyard and the press of the chill against my skin. Yet I felt it again, that presence, the feeling of being watched, multiplied this time, enveloped by whispers that huddled low, tugging at the edges of my sanity. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me, but I could hear that chanting again, crawling up from the depths of the floorboards, swirling around me. I stumbled back toward the lobby, desperate for anyone else, a guest, a stranger, someone to confirm this reality was still intact. But every door was locked tight, and the silence roared. Then I noticed the walls, covered in scratches, almost deliberate marking, a warning or perhaps a tally. An idea flickered in my mind, the realization that anyone who stayed near these two men, or worse, became a part of their horrific story. I had to escape, to leave this cursed place, before it consumed me, but as I reached for the phone to call for help, the power surged back on in a blinding flash, revealing each of the motel's doors ajar, no guests, just two monstrous shapes standing in the doorway of room 4, their eyes gleaming under the sterile light, grinning wide like they had waited for me. It was then that I understood the price of curiosity. With dread filling every fiber of my being, I knew it was already too late. I'd become a part of the very story I wished would remain just an urban legend, now forced to play a role in a nightmarish tale that would stretch well beyond the pages of any forgotten book. And as the darkness boiled and seeped into the very fabric of the motel, I realized my only option was to run. But if the legends were true, then there was nowhere left to hide. When I got the call from my mom about the eviction notice, it felt surreal, the kind of thing you hear about but never actually expect to encounter, especially not with her. She was always the one to follow the rules, keep everything in line, meticulously watching the apartment policies like they were sacred texts. But she was crying, the kind of weeping that cuts your soul, saying it was all some terrible mistake. How could they say she had a dog? Yet, the letters had piled up, and on the last one, a final notice in all caps, a grim ultimatum, and despite my protests, she insisted there was no dog in her small, two-bedroom apartment. As I drove over, the tires screeching against the asphalt like my nerves, her words tangled in my mind. The landlord was strict, sure, but this was unthinkable. I arrived there to find her in the living room, her face a shadow of confusion and despair as she flipped through the multiple notices stapled to her front door, each citing violating the no-dog policy. I tried to talk to her about it, to make sense of it, but the more I questioned, the more frantic she became, insisting that the entire situation felt so surreal, like she was in an episode of a bad sitcom gone wrong, and I couldn't help but see the glint of panic in her eyes. The apartment, though familiar, felt wrong, emptier somehow, a colder air creeping through, and there was a smell. My mind tried to pin it down but it was faint, a musky, dog-like odor that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Yet she had no dog, I repeated, just as much for myself as for her. I helped her pack some things away, though the notes took precedence, and suddenly every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder. The rustle of bags, stacking memories in boxes felt maddening, as if the walls were closing in on us, rejecting us, and with every lift of a box, every burst of laughter we shared over silly knickknacks, I felt an intimate sadness creeping in, something vile in the atmosphere shifting its weight. A reminder of what we were losing, the home filled with laughter and love, now turned hostile. The next day, I returned to sift through more boxes, desperate to help her face what felt like an oncoming storm, but with each layer we peeled back, something nagged at me, a gnawing sensation in my gut. That night, I was awakened by the sound of scratching, muffled but persistent, like tiny claws against wood, and I could hear my mom mumbling reassurances to the empty space around her, convinced this was all just a figment of a misconstrued policy, and every time I glanced toward her bedroom, I could swear the sounds were growing louder, more frantic, as if pleading for something, but there was nothing there, only shadows in her apartment that lurked too long, lingering, and a creeping sensation gripped me tighter. I finally decided I had to talk to the landlord, perhaps a visit would clear everything up, but he'd only sneered at me through his door, air thick with disdain, unperturbed by my questions or the mounting fear deep in my bones, until I turned to leave, and just as I did, he muttered something under his breath about the last tenant. I choked back the question I so desperately wanted to ask, who? But my mom's grace, her knack for soothing pains, had turned into an echo of confusion. I rushed back home, the concern gnawing deeper as I stared at my phone under the dim light, diving into the depths of online complaints for tenants in her building, combing through posts about strange occurrences, tenant gatherings, odd noises that escaped the walls, and even rumors of the previous tenant who had vanished, and it struck me like a punch to the stomach. The same claims, a deranged woman who kept a dog despite being told no, had floundered over manic laughter, all leading to whispered stories of her, lost, missing, and unaccounted for. By the time I returned to my mom's apartment, my hands shook as I rapped on the door, the scratching loud again, more pronounced, echoing in tandem with my heart. When she opened the door, her eyes were glassy, vacant with an understandable dread, and I stammered, asking her if anything was wrong, if she had seen anything strange, and she shook her head, clutching a framed picture of us together, a warmth lingering that felt impossibly distant. The scratching seemed to blend into the fabric of our conversation, and despite my instincts screaming for her to leave, we delved deeper into the darkness of rumors and denial, determined to repel what felt like a malicious force threatening to sever the essence of our lives tethered there. The night stretched into a deeply unsettling void, and I began to notice shadows posturing at the edges of my vision as I tried to sleep, flickers and flares that didn't belong. I realized I was being watched or followed, as strange hints of warmth glided over my skin like fur brushing against my pant leg, and then the panic pinched my heart when I saw it, a fleeting blur, a shadow skittering across the floor, and instinctively I called out to my mom, but she didn't respond, too lost, too far gone. I rushed to her room to find her curled up under the comforter, eyes shut tight, and beside her, on the floor, lay a ball of dirt and fur that seemed to pulsate, growing endlessly larger, insistent scratching sifting from its being until it finally split. A chill clawed through me as the shape emerged, an emaciated figure that resembled a dog, ghostly and frail, its eyes seeping with a knowing malice as it locked onto mine, and then turned toward her, a whimper, a plea. That very moment, though horrific, felt almost familial, like its presence cried of despair and longing while finally, as if it all culminated in this very second, my mom awoke, her gaze lost, and she smiled at the unwelcome guest. With every fiber of my being torn, I stepped back, dread pooling at my feet as reality spun, the walls peeling away, and before I could even scream, she whispered, "He just wants a home," while the creature leaned closer, its breath a chilling stench, and whatever light had once flickered in that apartment was snuffed out, drowning us both in darkness until all I could hear was scratching. People think I'm blind, but the truth is I'm too scared to open my eyes. You see, I've made this little act work for me, the sunglasses, the cane, the deliberate hesitation before I cross the street, all of it is a ruse that allows me to navigate a world that terrifies me too much to face head-on. It started years ago, after that incident where I nearly lost my life to something unfathomable, something I still can't bear to articulate. I can remember how the sun blazed down on me as I wandered through the park, lost in thought, when I stumbled upon a girl sitting alone on a bench, her face pale and twisted in anguish as she cradled something in her arms. I barely caught a glimpse before she screamed, a sound so horrendous and filled with despair that it knocked the air right out of me. She'd been holding a mangled doll covered in what I thought was just dirt, but the closer I got, the more I could see it was smeared with something dark that glistened like oil in the sunlight. Before I could even process what was happening, the girl locked eyes with me, and in those seconds, I felt the world close in. The gaze was unlike anything I had encountered, straight out of a horror film. Her eyes weren't just empty, they were voids, endless tunnels darkening my soul until I couldn't breathe. At that moment, her quivering lips formed words I still replay in my nightmares. "You have to help me. Please, please don't let her find you." It was then that I heard a rustling from the shadows, a movement so unnatural that for a split second, my instincts urged me to run, yet my body stood paralyzed. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of her, a figure emerging from the underbrush, her face shrouded in darkness, impossible to discern. She smiled as if she could already taste my fear, and I don't remember how I got back home. I just remember feeling this overwhelming dread, the primal instinct to check every corner of my room and lock myself away in the safety of my mind. I promised myself I'd forget about what I'd seen, that same summer evening when everyone else enjoyed the sweetness of ice cream and laughter while I retreated to my cocoon of darkness, the giggles and joy outside now a distant memory, replaced by the echoing whispers of dread that haunted my thoughts. I couldn't shake that girl's warning, her haunted expression burned into my brain like a brand. So I crawled deeper into my cocoon, learning to navigate the world without opening my eyes, every sound sharpening my senses, every touch inflicting a new wound of paranoia. A decade washed over me, and I became an expert at pretending, feigning blindness while the shadows outside creep in. I hear the notches of my neighbor's shoes against pavement, learn the rhythm of dialects filtered through worn fabrics softening time, feel the vibrations of laughter and rage. It all swirled around me while I remained a ghost in my own skin. Everything was a careful orchestra of pretense, an unspoken agreement as social expectations danced around my willful surrender to fear. But then the unsettling occurrences crept in, Late at night, I began to sense someone watching me, their gaze like ice against my skin, the creeping notion that the world had soured and that something wicked watched me in the shadows I had embraced. As each day passed, the air grew thicker with ominous tension. I wished I could open my eyes, just for a moment, to confront the very fears fueling my captivity, yet I feared that it was no longer simply a psychological prison but something corporeal. I could never quite articulate it, but dread hung so palpably in the air that even the birds didn't sing in the mornings. Friends slowly pulled away, whispers trailing behind them. Accusations of being a recluse no longer rolled off my back. When I had first started this charade, I thought I'd be safe from the darkness, I'd be a bystander in my own life, but now I understood something terrible about it. It fed on me. The shadows grew bold, peeling back layers of my mind, their whispers evolving into voices, then faces, lips twisted in mockery. They beckoned me to open my eyes, tearing me apart with every second I resisted. Sleep soon became my only refuge, but even there, the darkness didn't relent. Nightmares shifted into reality as I dreamt of being back in that park, confronted by that girl and the jagged figure lurking in the trees. Then one night, amid the cacophony of my visions, I was jolted awake by a soft sound, a gentle, almost childlike giggle, echoing from the corner of my room where I had stacked my pillows high, an effort to cocoon myself tightly under covers. I could feel the laughter wrapping around my fear like chains, and for the first time in years, curiosity dripped through the adrenaline. Against every instinct, I raised my hand to pull away the fabric, preparing myself for whatever lay beyond the layers of safety. The fabric rippled away like a curtain parting, and I closed my eyes tighter, so tightly that I almost forgot to breathe, and in that moment, I felt something cold and clammy brush against my arm. The giggling stopped, replaced by a heavy, ponderous silence that made my heart race. "I see you," a voice whispered, breath like ice on my cheek, and I realized with a horrifying clarity that whatever I had avoided for 10 years had finally found me. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I opened my eyes even just a crack, there was nothing, my terrified mind blanketed in darkness, no spectral figures waiting, no hints of the girl or the darkness of my dreams. I let out a shaky breath, a fleeting moment of victory before panic clawed back, and then I felt it again, that icy touch, paralyzing, insistent, and suddenly I understood that I could no longer hide. I was aware now, caught between fear and realization, that hiding had never shielded me from the truth. Fear itself had become the entity that lived in the darkness alongside me. And perhaps being blind wasn't a matter of sight, perhaps it was merely a choice I thought would save me that had instead led me deeper into the abyss. Maybe, just maybe, the thing I feared the most wasn't out there. But instead, it was the very act of seeing again that had become the real nightmare. When I was a kid, bedtime stories were a cherished ritual, and my grandmother had a knack for weaving the most chilling tales that made me shiver beneath my quilt while the shadows danced on the walls of my room. One evening, as the wind howled and rattled the shutters, she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and began her favorite story about a woman named Clara who lived in a small, forgotten town nestled by a murky lake. Clara, she said, was known for her beauty but was also marked by a dark secret. Every 2 years, on the night of the full moon, she would disappear for days, her absence cloaked in whispers of a curse that befell the women in her family. My heart raced as she described how the townsfolk would notice the lake's water rising higher and higher each time Clara went missing, as if it were hungry, longing for something. Grandma recounted how one fateful night, a brave young man decided to follow Clara into the woods, determined to uncover the truth behind her mysterious disappearances. He found her standing at the water's edge, her reflection not quite her own, eyes glinting like twin moons as if she were not entirely human. When he called out to her, a terrible wind swept through the trees, and she turned, revealing a face so twisted with sorrow that it sent him running in terror. I held on to my grandmother's words, especially the part where Clara would return, changed, with an unsettling calm and a knowing smile, hinting that she had made some kind of pact with the lake. My grandmother's voice faded and morphed into the night serenade, but that story haunted me, lingering in the back of my mind long after I turned the light out. Years passed, and I grew older, sitting through the usual byproducts of teenage drama and late-night adventures, all the while dismissing my grandmother's creepy tale as just that, a tale meant to frighten children into behaving. It wasn't until I received a call that shattered my ordinary life that I recalled her story clearly. My grandmother had passed away, and along with the grief came a wave of urgency to return to my childhood home for the funeral. Upon arriving, the air felt thick with unresolved secrets, the house standing eerily intact as if time had frozen. While going through her belongings for the wake, I stumbled upon an old weathered journal that bore Clara's name scrawled across the front. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages, revealing detailed accounts of a woman who lived in my grandmother's town, her lineage, her struggles, her bizarre disappearances. As I read, the words seemed to come alive, intertwining with the very fabric of my family's history. It revealed that my grandmother had always been fascinated by Clara and believed that she might share a distant relation to her. The final entry chilled me to the bone, describing that on the night of her final disappearance, Clara had purportedly seen a vision of herself by the lake, warning her that the next full moon would bring more than darkness, it would bring a reckoning. I felt a dreadful sense of urgency as I sealed the journal and prepared for the funeral, the tales of Clara seeping back into my psyche, linking them to my own bloodline. A few nights later, as I lay in my childhood bed once again, the thought of that cursed full moon lurked in the corners of my mind, but sleep enveloped me quickly, taking me into a dream-filled state where I felt pulled to the lake, an intimate encounter with the shadow of Clara herself. I swam through the thick fog dominating the area, the water cold, heavy, and alive, as if the lake was waiting for me, just as it had waited for Clara. I woke abruptly to the moonlight filtering through my window, cold sweat trickling down my spine, and a sense of dread clinging to me like a second skin. Then, a loud thumping noise echoed through the house, drawing me toward the sound like a moth to a flame. The clock on my nightstand ticked in rhythm with each thud, each pulse echoing where I sensed the inevitability of fate. Summoning whatever courage I could muster, I crept down the creaking hallways, the heavy air whispering tales of my grandmother's stories. Was Clara's fate now intertwining with mine? The thuds led me to a window overlooking the lake, and as I pulled the curtain aside, my breath caught in my throat. The water was shimmering beneath the moonlight, swirling as if it were alive, and there, standing at the edge, was a woman. She had long, flowing hair and an uncanny resemblance to my grandmother, with a smile that tore right through my being. I backed away as the figure raised a hand, beckoning me forward. I swayed with an overpowering mix of terror and fascination, the words from my grandmother echoing hauntingly in my mind, wanton beauty, terrible price. I felt the moon pull at my insides, and without conscious thought, I opened the window, the chill piercing through me as I stepped onto the ledge. An invisible force coaxed me closer to the edge of the precipice until the cool liquid splashed against my feet, my steps sinking into the depths. As I gazed into the lake's murky depths, I saw mirrored not only Clara but an uncanny flicker of my own face distorted by the surface's ripples, as if the lake was a gateway, reflecting my lineage, the dark truth binding Clara to my bloodline, a pact unfulfilled, an inheritance I had never known I held. Just as I felt myself slipping under, I heard my grandmother's voice, soft yet commanding. "Run!" I gasped for air, my heart pounding against my ribcage, and suddenly understood, the moon wasn't just a witness to their pact, it was a reminder that every 2 years, the lake was hungry again. The waves tugged at me, logs of silent screams and luminous faces flashing through, and I jolted awake, my body sprawled across my bed, the world around it no more than a nightmare away. But when the sun broke the horizon, I shuddered, knowing I couldn't escape Clara's curse, or the family ties that linked my fate to the darkness beneath the surface. My grandmother's stories weren't mere legend, they were a warning and an invitation, luring me into a game far older than the townsfolk, a pact sealed with blood and grief, that would set its sights on the remnants of her lineage every 2 years until one of us finally surrendered. My job is to watch people die. It's a phrase that sounds morbid, and maybe it is, but it's also a privilege I never asked for. I work for an organization shrouded in secrecy, one that operates on the edges of morality, where I'm classified as a handler. Every day, I log into an unassuming, nondescript app on my phone, entering a world of faceless profiles and grim circumstances. My assignment for the day was an unremarkable man named Leonard who, by all accounts, lived an unremarkable life, a desk job, a wife he never truly appreciated, and 2 kids who spent more time staring at screens than at each other. For 72 hours, I was tasked with documenting his every moment leading to an event he had no idea was about to shatter his existence. It all started when a ticking sound reverberated in my ear, the familiar countdown mechanism that signified the clock was starting. Leonard's death was imminent. I watched him as he went through his mundane routine, dousing his cereal with milk, ignoring an overdue bill as if it was a fly buzzing annoyingly in the corner of his mind. He called his wife, who was far too engrossed in a soap opera to pay attention to his banter about a new project at work. I could feel the anticipation building as night fell, cloaking the house in darkness, shadows playing tricks on his senses. The digital clock beside his bed blinked ominously, and I felt an electric thrill, as I did with every countdown, knowing that whatever fate awaited him would not shine light on the exceptional, but merely emphasize the tragedy of a life unfulfilled. The night dragged on, silence wrapping around the walls as Leonard eventually drifted into a deep sleep, unaware that his life was only a breath away from ending. Then it happened. A shuddering crash brought me to attention as I witnessed a figure slip into his yard, cloaked in darkness, lurking with an intent that sent adrenaline coursing through me. I couldn't intervene. I had to remain an observer, a ghost haunting the edges of his fate. I felt like a predator and prey simultaneously. The figure moved closer, the crunch of dead leaves beneath heavy boots echoing into the night, and Leonard stirred, his subconscious nudging him, but alas, he remained asleep, blissfully ignorant of the grisly ending that awaited him. Every second felt amplified, time twisted cruelly as the intruder drew closer, knife glistening in the dim light of the moon. I clenched my fists, my breath hitching, pleading for Leonard to wake, to fight back, but the cosmos demanded its price. The knife plunged into his body, a quick stab that punctuated the stillness. Leonard's awakening was brief, a fleeting moment where shock painted his face before his life began to drain from him. I felt the sharp pang of sorrow, the unmistakable tide of regret washing over me, even though I knew this wasn't my fault, even though I had no control over the events unfolding. Tears streamed down his cheeks, mingling with a growing pool of blood beneath him, and I stood witness to a life extinguished over a mere misunderstanding, a robbery gone wrong, the consequences of choices made and not made. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was stuck holding the camera lens of fate, unable to alter the picture. The intruder fled, leaving Leonard gasping for mercy that would never come. Relief flooded his eyes as he took in his last breath, and I could almost hear his final thoughts, a swirl of regrets, dreams untold, moments lost, and just like that, he slipped away. The countdown in my ear stopped, and I sat there, paralyzed, racked with an anguish that was both familiar and foreign to me. The app chimed softly, confirming his death, as a little notification flashed, handler assignment complete. It was over, yet nothing felt resolved. I had interpolated in a tragedy, somewhere between voyeurism and resignation, bearing witness to lives lost under the blanket of night. It became routine after that, my assignments stacking up like the shadows creeping along the walls of my reality. I often grappled with the ethics of it all. Some people deserved their fates, domestic abusers, frauds, people who brought suffering like dust on shoes, but others like Leonard were just caught in the ripples of chaos without their consent. Each death became a warning, a haunting reminder of the fragility of existence. I went home, haunted by the images that invaded my dreams, faces of the dying swirling like phantoms in the corners of my mind, their voices merging into a symphony of despair and loneliness. Nights turned darker, filled with shadows that danced mockingly between memories of their last breaths, and I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever meet someone who might help redeem the heavy weight I carried. A week passed, then another, and assignments continued improving in complexity, pulling me into lives I'd never known. One day it was a woman succumbing to cancer, another a child's accidental overdosing, all as vivid and harrowing as Leonard's last moments. Just when I thought I was numb to it all, I received a notification that froze me in place. Handler assignment, your own death. My heart raced. Who would dare place this burden upon me? I scrolled through the profile dedicated to me, and curiously, the bio read as a chilling confession. You've watched enough to understand that you're not the observer, you are merely another piece in an elaborate game, a pawn, destined to die next. It was a threat wrapped in a riddle, and suddenly everything I had witnessed dripped with newfound horror. I realized I was not just a passive observer, I was being set up, a character in someone else's twisted play, the one who had danced between the lines of fate for too long. The clock began ticking again, and the quiet in my room felt alive with malevolent energy. I glanced around, feeling the walls closing in as panic rose in my chest. No longer was I immune to the whims of destiny, I was now encased in its grasp, a puppet ensnared in strings I had thought were mine to control. I felt the urge to call for help, but who could I trust? I knew too well that my actions could jeopardize not only my life but the lives I had already trampled over. I couldn't disappear, that wasn't an option anymore. The only possible outcome was to fight. I needed to understand the sinister forces behind this organization, figure out a way to reverse the curse that had traded me for my assignments. As I plunged into a desperate search for answers, I delved deep into the app's code, traversing the digital shadows until I stumbled upon a hidden forum buried beneath layers of encryption. A murky community of handlers just like me, each whispering hints of salvation or demands for silence, their narratives entwining with mine, each exchanging their own near brushes with death, confessions of betrayals perpetrated by the hand that feeds. My fingers trembled as I uncovered a shocking truth: this handler system was more like a feeding ground for a shadowy entity that fed on the fear and pain of the dying. But as the realization sank in, a chilling notification lit up my screen: new handler execution assignment, terminate your own fate. It was time to finally confront the specters I had unwittingly invited into my life, and with a heavy heart, I resolved to break the cycle, to unearth the truth and terminate the twisted watcher that loomed just out of sight, forever waiting for me to crumble under the weight of my cursed voyeurism. My heart pounded as I prepared for the storm ahead, and I could no longer tell if I was running towards something or from something already looming over me, but there was only one certainty: I would do everything to survive, even if that meant staring directly into the abyss I once thought I controlled. I've worked as a barista at a small coffee shop for the past 3 years, and in all that time, I've learned to interpret the different faces of our customers, but there's one customer none of us are allowed to serve. His name is Mr. Hargrove, and he only comes in late at night when the shop is nearly empty, his silhouette stretching in the dim light that flickers above our heads like it's nervous just illuminating him. My manager, Clara, told me to steer clear of him on my first day. It was a slow evening, a light drizzle painting the world outside, and when he walked in, I could feel the air shift. We were the only 2 people in the shop, me, fiddling on my phone behind the counter, and him, standing there like a shadow that didn't belong. Clara, trying to handle his insistent stare, whispered that he always ordered the same thing: a black coffee, no sugar, but every time it's like pulling teeth. I could see rings of dirt beneath his fingernails, and the way his eyes glimmered in the dim lighting reminded me of something not quite human. As I watched from behind the counter, Clara approached him, her tight smile faltering. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hargrove, but..." she started, and he cut her off. I didn't catch the words, but I could see her skin pale, her hands tremble, and she retreated like a wounded animal. "I told you not to serve him," she hissed at me later when I tried to ask what happened. "Just don't." After that, I observed him from a distance, a peculiar ritual playing out every few weeks when he graced us with his presence. The first time I spoke to him, it was innocently enough. I had just started a shift when he settled into a corner booth, his eyes boring into the wall. "Can I get you something, sir?" I asked, heart racing as my voice trembled like a leaf caught in a storm. He turned to me slowly, and I regretted speaking. His gaze was cold, unfathomable, like staring into a bottomless abyss, and all I could do was nod when he whispered, "Not for me." He always looked well kept, in a dirty kind of way. The same tattered coat, the same scuffed shoes. He never seemed to eat or drink, just sat there, quietly observing. The second encounter brought even more intrigue. Clara had overheard a customer from across the street talking about him, a rumor swirling around that he was a collector of lost souls, someone who could draw out secrets just by staring. That night, the unease settled deeper into the marrow of my bones as I watched him turn over a small object in his hands, what looked like an old pocket watch. The way he turned it made it seem alive, ticking in a rhythm that harmonized with my racing heart. From that evening onward, unavoidable curiosity gnawed at me: what could he possibly want? Until I could no longer ignore it, despite Clara's warnings. After many nights of his unsettling presence without any word from him, it was my turn to serve him, and I was terrified but also exhilarated. "I want to know about the watch," I said softly, my voice wavering like a candle exposed to the wind. He stared at me deeply, and for a moment, I thought he would flame my skin with his gaze. But then, a serene smile broke through the storm. "You want to know what it holds?" he replied, voice low like the rustle of fallen leaves. "Humanity's regrets." I recoiled in horror. Was this some kind of twisted game? My heart raced, and I took a step back, but curiosity drowned my fear. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Each tick holds time lost and the weight of desires unfulfilled," he said, raising the watch toward me, the small glass base glinting in the light before vanishing as the shadows embraced it again. "Listen closely, and you may hear your own." I shook my head. I didn't want to hear. But as dread wrapped around me, I felt a fierce tug toward that watch, an unending compulsion. Sometimes, I would leave the shop when he was there, but my fellow employees, drawn by curiosity, spoke of things they'd seen, guilty shadows, reflective tears, and naked fears shared through silent conversations, weighed by his unyielding gaze. Clara, meanwhile, grew more distant, her face a mask of worry. "You need to listen to me," she warned one night, voice tight like a noose. "There's darkness surrounding him. Those who interact with him don't come back the same, and I'm telling you, it's not just a myth." But when Mr. Hargrove returned, the call of the unknown was too strong. One late shift, I found myself alone. Clara had taken the night off. I heard the bell above the door jingle, and my heart thudded painfully. It was him. His presence suffocated the air, wrapping fear and fascination around me tightly. "You're curious tonight," he said, voice silky smooth, as if he already understood my soul. "What do you want?" Though my instincts screamed at me to turn and run, my mouth betrayed my mind. "I want to know. I want to hear it." His eyes gleamed, and he reached into his coat, pulling out that damn pocket watch. When I pressed my ear against it, I was met with a cacophony of whispers, my own voice lost among the tides of regret, each tick echoing moments I was too terrified to confront. It shook me to my core. I tried to pull away, but he gripped my wrist firmly, the contact searing. "You seek knowledge, yet fear the truth," he rasped, and for the first time, his lips curled into something sinister. Then, he let go. I staggered back, the air sparking with dread, and in that moment of clarity, I saw it, the shadows that danced behind him toiling and reaching, hungry for my soul. I bolted from the shop, legs propelled by a primal urge to escape, and I didn't look back, running blindly into the rain-soaked streets and gasping for breath. Days turned into nights of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Clara insisted I take some time off, as the whispers from my encounter echoed in my mind. "Just forget him," she said, but I couldn't. One night, weeks later, I found myself drawn back to the shop. The lights were on, and the air felt heavy, as if something was waiting for me inside. I pushed the door open, heart racing, and that chill ran down my spine when I saw him. It was like a nightmare that refused to fade, solitude draping over his figure as if the darkness had claimed him. "You came back," he breathed, voice thick with unspent promises. I wanted to flee again, to leave the horrors at bay, but his presence lured me in, and soon, the walls began to close in. He gestured toward the corner booth with the pocket watch resting on the table, glistening like a siren's call. With every step closer, the shadows churned as if alive, and I heard a symphony of screams wrapped in silence. "You wanted to know," he welcomed, inviting me into the depths of despair. I reached for the watch but recoiled. My reflection in the glass showed a hollow-eyed creature lost within, and the weight of my choices pressed down like a stone. "Face what you've wanted to forget," he urged. "Only then can you free yourself." But I couldn't. I was tethered to my past, a prisoner in my own skin, and in that moment, I realized I had become just like him, a vessel for darkness. I turned and fled, slamming the door behind me as I stepped back into the real world, gasping for the sweetness of freedom that tasted like despair. Days turned into weeks again, and I buried myself in the routines of life, but every distant echo of that haunting melody of ticks from the watch taunted me, waiting for my mind to drift back to that dreadful night. I heard whispers around town. Customers would come in and mention a strange man who graced his shadowy presence upon them, his gaze haunting and chilling, and it felt like the collected regrets of the town had found a new vessel to carry their burdens. It dawned on me painfully that I hadn't just met Mr. Hargrove, I had joined the ranks of a growing clientele drawn toward the inexplicable. And as panic clawed at my chest, I realized the truth: it's never just one person. The shadows they carry, the darkness we all harbor, it chips away at humanity, drawing us deeper into despair until we find ourselves returning, drawn to that same cursed pocket watch. Maybe it was too late, or maybe there never was a way to escape. But as I look back at the doorway of that tiny coffee shop, watching the flickering lights spill into the night, I'm haunted by the knowledge that every tick echoes across the lives of those trapped within. We are bound by regrets of our own making, and in the chilling truth we find ourselves echoing in the silence of the shadows.